which he was able to write the Srimad Bhagavatam was a vision of these three categories, these three tattvas. Vyasadeva admonished him, you have compiled the Vedas, but they're confusing. We need a literature that emphasizes bhakti. And Vyasa sits in meditation, and what does he see? He sees Krishna. He sees the material nature. He sees the living entities. He becomes Tattvadarshi. And it just turns out that these three categories are referred to as three types of power. Okay, let's move further in this analysis. So the Bhagiranga Shakti, the Tatastha Shakti, these are two types of potency, two types of energy, two types of power that belong to Krishna. And because they're Krishna's and they come from him, they are also part of him. One with and different from him. This world is Krishna's energy, and therefore it is part of him. The living entities who are caught up in this world, they are Krishna's. They are part of him. This is a fundamental principle that is emphasized again and again in the Srimad Bhagavatam, and yet in our institution we tend to overlook it. The Virat Rupa, materialistic perception of Krishna, his material form. And yet first canto, second canto, third canto, this is a theme that reoccurs again and again. 10th canto, Bhagavad Gita, 7th chapter, 11th chapter, Krishna is showing himself as the Virata Rupa. The Vedas, the most significant, important prayers of the Vedas, the Purusha Sukta, it's all about this. Describing the world as Krishna's energy, as part of him. Chandrama manaso jatas chaksho suryo ajayata mukharindras chardischa prana vayurajayata. The moon is his mind, the sun is his eyes, Indra is his face, his breathing is the prana, so the wind, the prana, the wind in this world, it is his breathing. Brahmanosya mukhamasi, the brahmanas are his head. Chaksho, Bahurajanya Kritavi, the Kshatriyas are his arms. Uru Tarasya Yad Vaishya, the Vaishyas are his thighs. Padyagam Sudro Ajayata, the Sudras are his feet. This is most profound. All these different sections of society, they are Krishna. Right? We surrender to Krishna's lotus feet. The Sudras are Krishna's feet, don't disrespect them. They are his lotus feet. We are taught to honor, revere Krishna's lotus feet. We are taught, don't just look at Krishna's face. We start from the feet. The implications here for this theology, for management and organizations, for being in this world, are most profound. So somehow we have a tendency to overlook this, to leave it aside. We focus on the body, the Krishna servants, and bhakti practice, and Vrindavan pastimes, and we overlook this aspect of the Srimad Bhagavatam, of the Bhagavad Gita, which is so incredibly profound for living in the world. How to live, how to be in the world. Interacting and engaging with everything as Krishna's. It's Krishna's energy, right? We're taught that Krishna's energy. Everyone is Krishna's energy. Okay, you're a manager. What's your role here? You're a steward. You are a caretaker. You are responsible for some power. Tread lightly, tread delicately, because it's Krishna's. It's Krishna's Shakti. Don't claim it as yours, don't assume proprietorship. Ishyavasyamidam sarvam yatkincha jagatyam jagat. Know that everything in this world is owned and controlled by Krishna. So some examples. Akrura. So we have the 9 processes of bhakti, Navanga bhakti, and we have exemplars of Shravan. Who's the example for Shravanam? Parikshit Maharaj. Yeah. Who's the exemplar for Kirtanam, for chanting? Sukadeva Goswami. Who's the exemplar for Smaranam?
Prahlad Maharaj.
Prahlad Maharaj. Who's the exemplar for Vandanam, for prayers? Akrura. Read his prayers. What does he pray? Krishna, you are the Lord of Vrindavan, you play a flute, your hair is bedecked with a peacock feather. It's not there. Or maybe the prayer like we would offer, Krishna, you are the Supreme Lord, I'm conditioned in the material world, please help me to remember you. Even that not. The exemplar of prayer, he describes Krishna as the source of the 24 material elements. These elements as his energy. How this world is expanded from him, is dependent on him, is resting in him. So it's worth considering why the exemplar of Vandanam is making that prayer, describing Krishna as the Lord of everything, of all the different aspects of this material nature. Earth, water, fire, air, ether, mind, intelligence, false ego, the senses, the potency of the senses. It's worth considering. It's worth considering why Lord Shiva prays that way. It's worth considering why Krishna's father, when he finally figures out at Kurukshetra, I mean he's had this insight in the past, but at one point at Kurukshetra, he asks the Brahmanas who arrive, he asks Narada Muni and the sages, what is the goal of life? How can I achieve the perfection of life? And they say, are you kidding? They say, how astonishing. Familiarity breeds contempt. That's how Prabhupada translates it. Here is the Father of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and he's asking us how to achieve perfection. Who the object of worship is. And so they give a response. Krishna is the Supreme Godhead, and the goal of life is to achieve him and to engage in bhakti yoga practices that cultivate our relationship with him. And then at the end he has this epiphany. Wow, Krishna is the Supreme Lord. I thought of him as my son. And he offers prayers, and these are the prayers. You are the Lord of the entire cosmic manifestation. Everything comes from you. The different aspects of the material nature are your energies. He describes the Virata Rupa. Similarly, in the Srimad Bhagavatam, we have the Vedas themselves. This is a great moment in the Bhagavatam where the Vedas personally offer prayers to Krishna. So we would understand this must be the essence of all the Vedas. And what do they say? They express these same principles. So it's a reoccurring and important theme of the Bhagavatam, one that I would suggest we would all benefit from spending more time engaging with, because the implications for living in this world, the implications for being in this world are most profound. I have extracted 4 implications here. When we recognize that everything is Krishna's, everyone is Krishna's, we realize that we can't own anything, so we give up that sense of possessiveness. We recognize that what's Krishna's has to be used in his service. So what's our role? Our role is as steward. By the way, there's a whole literature on stewardship, leadership as stewardship, management as stewardship. The manager as a steward, as a caretaker of resources that don't belong to the manager. If we understand this, we recognize that we can't hate anyone or anything. And in the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna asks Arjuna to describe the characteristics of a transcendentalist, Krishna has this repeated theme throughout the Gita. He describes how a transcendentalist doesn't hate anyone. Doesn't hate anyone or anything. When I realize this, then I try to effectively eliminate that word from my vocabulary. Whenever I found myself thinking, I hate this, I hate that, I thought, oh, no, don't hate anyone, don't hate anything. That's a word that has no place in the Vaisnava vocabulary, other than to say what we don't do. The transcendentalist does not hate anyone or anything. To the contrary, the devotee sees everyone and everything is connected to Krishna. And so, as Krishna explicates in the 7th chapter, the devotee can see everyone and everything as connected, and Krishna gives us so many nice examples to help us reflect. Of bodies of water, I am the ocean. Of mountains, I am the immovable Himalayas. Of secrets, I am silence. Of humans, I am the monarch of, and so on and so forth. These are just indications to help us understand that Krishna is everywhere, in everything. And so when we recognize this, then there's no chance of separation. And so for living in the world, the implications, you go to work or you go to fulfill your responsibilities, and you're recognizing that everyone and everything is Krishna's. You have a whole different relationship with your work. You have a whole different relationship with your colleagues. You have a whole different relationship with the energy that you're engaging with as you perform your work. There's no longer this dichotomy. This is my spiritual life and that's my work. That's my life. When I'm at the temple, then I'm doing spiritual life and everything else is unfortunate, something that I have to do. And I do it with resentment because I want to be spiritual. That's Bhagavad Gita ABC. Arjuna's stuck in this dichotomy. He can't understand how he can be on a battlefield and be a transcendentalist at the same time, which is what Krishna is asking him. And people ask me, Prahlad, this Bhagavad Gita, I don't get it. It's supposed to be a spiritual text, and yet the context is a battlefield, and Krishna telling someone to fight war. How can that ever be spiritual? And I told them, I said, we have excuses. Each and every one of us have excuses for why we can't be spiritual. My family, my job, my situation, it's unfortunate, but I can't be spiritual in this situation. So we put that forth as an excuse. I says, but none of us have an excuse as good as Arjuna. Arjuna had the best excuse. You want me to fight a war? How can that be spiritual? And Krishna said, yeah, and I want you to do that. I want you to be a transcendentalist here, on the front line of the battlefield. How is that possible? It's possible when we understand this. That everything is Krishna's. All energy is Krishna's. Everyone is Krishna's. And therefore, I engage it in his service. Any thoughts? Reflections? Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking that it's really strange that even though this would be a very solid foundation of our entire philosophy, yet there is so much influence in terms of false renunciation and dividing. And I was thinking that this is very clear, unfortunately, but it seems like clear influence of Mayavad concept, because Mayavadis, their main criteria or their main motto is Brahma Satya, Jaganmithya. They want to separate Maya from Krishna, or from spirit, from Brahman.
Yeah.
So Mayavadis are always thinking, oh, this is Maya, this is Maya, this is not spiritual, I want to be spiritual.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. So we have that tendency. Even coming to Krishna consciousness, we believe we have to reject everything to become the Lord's, as Arjuna thought. And this is most profound. This is a message. This is a message that can change the world. It's that profound. This is a message that you can take to United Nations, that you can take to any peace forum, that you can take to interreligious or intercultural dialogue. This is a message that you can take to the boardroom. It's so profound, and it is so emphasized in our philosophy, and it is so neglected by us.
Can you repeat the message?
Absolutely. It's that everything and everyone is divine. They are part of the divine. And because of that, we cannot own or possess anything. We can only serve as custodians. And that all energy is to be used in loving service. Bhakti yoga. Bhakti, love, yoga, connection, or service. That there is no place for hate or disrespect of anyone or anything. And that if we can develop this consciousness, then we will be constantly in divine consciousness, in transcendence, even while engaged in the world. This is a whole platform for living and being in the world. And a key message of the Bhagavad Gita. We tend, as Maharaj was saying, to go for the Jnana, the Vedantin Jnana Upanishadic message of the Gita, which is renounce, understand the difference between matter and spirit. There is soul, there is a material body. You are not that material body. We emphasize that aspect. But there's a whole other message there that is just as profound and so practical, so incredibly practical in its implications. As a roadmap for living and for being and organizing, participating. Yeah.
You can see the history history of religion that this argument has also been used to justify certain practices which are clearly not in line with Dharma.
Okay.
Specifically in broad terms also.
Please
Like an example would be to conquer the people for their own good, to give them Christianity, for example. Because before they were not enlightened. Or devotees wanted to conquer the planet also. And it's the same mentality. In the name of Prabhupada, doing the same atrocities like in the name of Jesus Christ. So, with the good intentions, take the way to hell and using everything in service of Krishna, like the Muslims would say, yes, with the sword, we use the sword in service of Allah to spread his message everywhere and conquer the world again. So this whole notion of possessing everything in the name of the Lord. I mean, so it's very tricky.
Okay, I get where you're going. So you're going towards Yukta Vairagya, and that we will take resources and use them in Krishna's service. I'm suggesting that the implications here are for, they advocate or they lead us towards a respectful engagement, where we cannot assume propriety, we cannot assume a position of domination and control.
In the name of God.
Yes, but why do you need to be the representative who has to have all of that control and power? I get where you, I get where you've gone with that interpretation, and I would like to lead the discussion. But thank you for pointing it out. I hadn't even considered that as a potential interpretation or misinterpretation.
It's an asuric mentality trying to assert Krishna's energies in the name of Krishna.
Ravana, that's, well, okay, Ravana didn't do it in the name of Krishna, but I definitely remember that from my childhood. That was definitely a mentality. They had to build a temple in New Varshana in Auckland, New Zealand, and so basically, I laugh, but I shouldn't. Devotees would be off at the sawmill nearby in the night, loading the car, the vans with the trailers with wood, taking them up to where the construction was going on, and that's how a good part of that temple was built, the older one. That's just one example. I'm not going to talk about stealing cars and the rest in the name of Krishna. That's definitely what I'm not advocating here. Any other reflections? So, just building more on what Prahlad said, we tend to be quite Vedantin in our approach to presenting Krishna consciousness. When I say Vedantin, I'm meaning more in the mood of Advaita Vedanta. Yeah, the Maya. So we tend to emphasize Vairagya, we tend to emphasize rejection of all that is material, to focus purely on the transcendent, which is not practical for most 99% of the population. This other message, this additional message that's given in our Shastras, in the Bhagavad Gita, in the Bhagavatam, I would suggest is a lot more practicable. Okay, I want to carry on then. Here's your Yukta Vairagya. Bhaktivinoda Thakur tells the story of Pradyumna. There's your implication. Killing Shambhara with the help of Rati. So, you know the story of Krishna's son Pradyumna, stolen at birth by a demon, dropped in the water, swallowed by a fish, taken to the kitchen of that demon Shambhara, and then opened up, discover a baby. The baby's handed over to Rati, one of the servant maids in the palace, who in fact knows who he is. She's in fact the wife of Cupid, Pradyumna, who's been there waiting for him. And then at one point, as Pradyumna grows, she says, this demon Shambhara, he is a demon, he needs to be eliminated, and I'm going to teach you how to do it, because he's a magician. He's a demon, he knows magic. So the only way to defeat him will be if you also use magic. You can go with your sword and be powerful, but he's going to bewilder you with magic, so you need to learn the magic from him. So she teaches Pradyumna the magic, and Pradyumna goes and confronts Shambhara and defeats him. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur says, this is an example where we use the very thing that we want to defeat by using that thing itself. So using the material energy as a way towards overcoming our conditioning or attachment to the material energy. The other example, a nice example in the Bhagavatam, is of the gopis and Rukmini Devi, both praised to personified material nature. Durga, Katyayani, Mahamaye, Mahayogin Nirishwari, Nanda Gopasukam Devi, Patimme Krute Namaha. The gopis prayed to Katyayani that you are the great Maya, Mahayogin Nirishwari, you are the controller of great powers, of yogic powers. Please arrange that the son of Maharaj Nanda will become our husband. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur explains both of these stories. Rukmini praying to Ambika, the gopis praying to Katyayani as an example where the Vaishnava will engage the material energy towards, as a way to reaching Krishna, or towards achieving Krishna. That's profound. Okay. Any other thoughts or questions on this?
If you were to present that previous list of 4 things
Yeah.
in a corporate environment, would you use Krishna's name, or would you, like, my inclination is to speak of a benevolence that's always available and present. Would you present it that clearly, or would you present something a little more vague?
Yeah, sure. Great question here about how we refer to the Supreme Personality of Godhead when we interact and engage in different forums. And I would like to open this for discussion. I'll tell you my own experience. Most of the time, as a first off engagement, I refer to the divine. And when I'm engaging in yoga schools, most of the time I start out with the divine. And at some point I might transition over to the Supreme Divinity. Then I might transition a little bit later to the Supreme Personality, and then I might say Krishna. If people are spending an hour and a half with me or 2 hours in a kirtan program, that's how I'll language my engagement with them. Another thing that I would like to share with you, something that I've discovered more recently and that I'm so excited about, because for a Vaishnava to talk about the divine is seriously unsatisfactory, unsatisfying, because it's so vague and so broad. Recently I've discovered a way, and it directly relates to these points and to this. I've discovered a way of taking people on a journey that I can start talking about the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna, and without putting up red flags. Because when we talk about God, and the person God, particularly in Australia, America's a lot more religious. than Australia. And Europe is a lot more. So America is a lot more religious than Europe. America is a lot more religious than Australia. Americans are a lot more open to God. You have it on your bills. In God we trust, and your president says, God bless America. And yeah, we don't do that. Europe is quite reticent to that as well. And so, languaging that I use, I start out by talking about bhakti yoga, so loving connection, a literal translation. Love, bhakti, yoga, connection, linking, connecting. Loving connection with whom? I say with the divine. What is the divine? According to the Gita, the divine is present in all things. The divine is present everywhere. The divine is present in all beings. All energy is an expansion of the divine, and so in the bhakti tradition we learn to live with gratitude and respect for every living being. Vidya Vinaya Sampane, we might go there. And then I say, but then the bhakti texts speak of other aspects to the divine. And so, present everywhere, that's a reference to Brahman, divine as Brahman. And then there's a localized aspect as Paramatma, present in the hearts of all living beings. And then I say, and then the bhakti texts also speak of the personality, the divine personality, the supreme person who is the source of these. And with unlimited names, like according to the different characteristics, like Govinda and Gopinath and Krishna. And what I find is that when I take it, and you can have a relationship, a personal relationship, and that we get our personality from that personality that is the supreme source, or the supreme divine. The supreme divine is not deficient in any way. He's present everywhere, in the universe, present within the hearts of all beings, as a friend, as a witness, as a guide. People really like that, providing remembrance, providing inspiration, providing guidance. And he has his personality. You can have a direct relationship as a lover, as a friend. You can have parental affection. And when I go this way, very broad from the universe to the localized guide and friend to a personality, I find that I can really take my audience with me. And I can't say it's universal acceptance because I haven't interviewed everyone afterwards, but the feedback I receive is the feedback that I've received is that people have told me that, yeah, I brought my friend along, a committed Mayavadi impersonalist, but the feedback was that they said there was nothing that they could disagree with you, nothing that they could disagree with in what you said. So I find that by going that way, you kind of address their conceptualizations, a conceptualization that they will be open to embrace, to accept, and then you just help them go one step further.
Yes.
And then just one step further, and there's no protest. That's my experience, and I'm really excited having discovered it just this past couple of years. Anyone else have experience with like your languaging when you talk about Krishna in these different forums? Yeah.
Sometimes with students of science, it gets a little tricky because by definition, many of them don't believe in the scriptures, right? Because if we bring up the scriptures, then they'll be like, okay, where is it from? What's the context it's from? It's never taken from an absolute source. So very often, we need to present the divine or Krishna as a hypothetical paradigm.
Yeah.
So we start off by talking about him as a paradigm. And so suppose if he exists, then hypothetically, then we bring in the philosophy. So then at the end of it, based on the hypothesis, they are kind of convinced, okay, there's a very high chance that he must exist.
Right.
So let me know more.
Yeah,
But if you bring in Krishna, even at the end, if you bring in Krishna, immediately they lose interest.
It's red flags.
Yeah.
It's rejection.
So I guess the audience really matters.
Absolutely.
I mean, so it's the same thing. It's still
Yeah.
presenting the same thing,
Yeah.
but the language is very important.
Yeah. Thank you.
I have experience of people who are more panteists, so they believe in divine presence everywhere in nature.
Yeah.
So I take them from there.
Yeah.
And they're worshipping more demigods sort of beings, the Mother Earth and so on.
Yeah.
And it's always nice when they have a little devotion and service attitude like that.
Mm.
They're caring, ethical individuals and communities. The family star, connecting it more to broader universal form applications, but also like more bhakti towards specific deities. So engaging them in the service of the Vaishnavas, because these deities are Vaishnavas and Vaishnavas, and then leave it there. See how it goes along the journey. Because Krishna is so patient with everyone, so we got to be patient also.
Yeah.
And if there's someone engaging in service to the bigger picture,
Yeah.
that's amazing already.
Yeah.
This will go far.
Thank you. So one other thing that you've raised, and what I present in relation to this universal Virata Rupa aspect, is that the Shastras described, so Chandrama, the moon is his mind, the Surya is his eye, so these demigods have their place as parts of the greater Purusha. And that Purusha is referred to in the Vedas, in the Gita, as Vasudeva, as Krishna. And so it's a way of acknowledging the divinity of those deities, but also seeing them in relation to, as dependent on, the Adi Purusha. So thank you for raising that, because it's a point that I'm also able to make. And once again, when I present it within that context, there tends to be a much broader acceptance as well. Yeah.
If I can just add to that point, it's actually a very good point. Because I'm from Singapore, and one reason why ISKCON is banned in Singapore is because the early devotees used to go to Hindu temples and criticize their mode of worship, saying they're worshipping demigods. Or they would go to the Chinese community and say they're worshipping ghosts. Right? And so collectively these people revolted against the Hare Krishnas, and we kind of got banned in Singapore, and we're still banned now. So if with this kind of mentality, if we present, it would have been a different picture.
Right. Yeah, thank you. I think it's the only country in the world that Prabhupada was denied entry. Singapore. And I think in Nepal it's gone through a register for many, many years for similar reasons. The Brahmanas opposed ISKCON being registered as a religion, and it was only when the king was overthrown and democracy brought in. Is that right?
No, only before very orthodox.
Yeah.
Because devotees were able to contact Queen and distribute the books, so this is very favorable. And Orthodox Brahmanas were practically convinced by Queen, but they still allowed them to no initiations, no sikhas, very strict conditions.
Okay.
So we entered there and
Right.
that was my years before, but it was really very strict conditions.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm appreciating how you upgrade the name as you know, in your presentation. That's really wonderful. I find, answering Deva's question, and people that I deal with, professionals, and also people that are leaders in different countries, the terminology of source has become more widely used now. To start from there, and somehow everybody can kind of relate to that. There's a source, there's some beginning and something, and then go with the upgrade as you just shared. That's just really good.
Yeah, thank you. The source. Wonderful. Yes?
I also do the same strategy and have good experience with it. And in terms of the demigods, I often explain that all these demigods, what kind of benedictions they give. And then I end up, if you go to Krishna, you end up with nothing material. He doesn't give anything.
How does that come?
I mean, in a humorous way, no? And then it makes them think, and it works quite a explainer, no? It's really bhakti, devotion.
It's about love, yeah.
Works well.
Wonderful, thank you.
Alright. It's interesting, in Thailand, they worshipping Vishnu and Lord Ram traditionally, and in Thai culture, you know, every single deity has some purpose, there is some benefit. But when they are asked, like, what's the purpose of, what's the benefit of worshiping Vishnu, they just say, it's just traditional. There is no benefit involved.
Yes.
To the point about Americans being more piously inclined, there was a lecture Prahlad says in one place, we don't give a damn what you believe. So many Americans are saying they believe in God, but then the practice is, it's a lot of hypocrisy.
Yeah.
So especially the young generation, they sense that, and so God is like this very abhorrent idea to many of them.
Okay.
And in my experience, what can be attractive about this philosophy is and the way you presented it, which is very smart and comprehensive, is that it's a beautiful reason to serve. That you can find an opportunity to serve anywhere, everyone, and anything. And I've noticed that that's what I should look for in people that I'm preaching with, not if they believe in God or not, because often if they do believe in God, it will keep them away from Krishna consciousness because they believe in a Christian God. But if they believe in the idea of service, then very quickly, if they understand that we see things in this way, they'll at least stick around. They may not adopt the philosophy totally, but they'll at least contribute something to what we're doing, and they'll recognize the value in our presence, our community, etc.
Yeah. Wonderful, thank you. It's such a profound, universal message.
Yeah. Benevolence is what I use often.
I talk of the three Oms.
Always?
The three: omnipresent, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent.
That's nice.
It works with the yoga.
It's a very nice thing, so the addition to what you said. Recently we were giving a seminar in university in the psychology department. People, Indian people, but they're very much influenced by Western philosophers and stuff. But when we presented the psychology in the level of mind and started to speak about similar points like divine presence at one similar level, and you can see differently, people on different levels, but they're not arguing with you because you're addressing their concepts. And then
That's right.
I see from where to take them ahead.
Yeah.
If they stuck in the ceiling there, you just can't stay there and
Right.
just speak on their level. So we started from mind level.
Yeah.
It's like because they different philosophers what they say. And so once they're already ready, you can take them to intelligence, and then slowly you can go. And it was very nice. And ultimately we concluded that actually divine is everywhere, and unless we address the root of everything, we are insane.
Wonderful. Thank you. One thing that I get the students to do when we're at the beginning of term, I say, everyone move across the room and meet somebody that you've never spoken to before, and then switch over, now give feedback to the person that you've been interacting with, like what they did to connect with you, and then I have a room discussion, class discussion around what is it that enabled you to connect. And so one of the most, so yes, it's eye contact, it's being present to the person that we're interacting with, so it's the body language, that it's being present. But then something else that's really important and that comes up reoccurringly is finding something in common. Once you land on something that we both share in common, we went to the same school, or we know somebody, our grandparents come from the same town, or we like the same sports team, or whatever it is, there's immediately something for people to talk about and to share in common, and they bond over that. And so in our interaction and engagement with others, if we can find the common ground and agree there and establish affinity, a closeness, then that becomes the basis for building the relationship from there. And the other thing, in relation to what you mentioned about according to our audience, so presenting according to the interests, the inclinations of our audience. Narada Muni is the example. Read Srimad Bhagavatam, and It's written by Vyas. It's about, one way that you can read Bhagavatam is it's the adventures of Narada Muni. Because he appears in every canto and he's preaching. And how is he preaching? Well, he adjusts, he adapts his strategy according to the person that he's interacting with. If it's the sons of Prajapati Daksha, he gives them a hard line, surrender everything, just focus on Vishnu, because that's what they can take. But if he's talking to Paranjana, to Prachinabarhi, he's going to tell them a story about this king who lived long ago, and he performed sacrifice, and Prachinabarhi is saying, wow, I do sacrifices, I'm a king. What happened to him? And so he tells them this metaphor, he tells them a story. If it's Prahlad, he has another approach. If he's teaching Kayadu, Prahlad in the world with Dhruva, another approach. If it's the sons of Kuvera, Kuvera and Manigriva, he curses them. Very uncharacteristic of Narada Muni to curse somebody, but that's what they needed for their situation. So there's so much we can learn. Outside of the Bhagavatam, we have Narada Muni with Mugrari, and famously with Valmiki, okay, you chant the name of death, Mara, 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 Valmiki becomes the author of Ramayana. So Narada Muni, he's really meeting people at their level and engaging with them in a way that will work for them. He doesn't have a one-size-fits-all approach to his outreach. He's really adapting, adjusting, accommodating the needs of the soul that he's engaging with. He, like you were saying, as a servant, how can I serve you? Understanding their needs and engaging with them accordingly. Okay, having discussed the Virata Rupa, Krishna as the Virata Rupa, this idea of Krishna as the source of all Shakti, of all energy, I want to go to something else which is a bit more complicated, but also incredibly profound and has incredible implications for management and organizations as well. And that is the Chaturvyuha. Oops, there we are. There's a lot of information on that screen, and if I had more time, I would have given you an individual screen for each of the vyuhas. On the other hand, I did want you to see the relationships between the four together. Vasudeva, Shankarshan, Pradyumna, and Aniruddha. We hear of the Chaturvyuha, we go Om Keshavaya Namaha, Narayana, Vishnave, Madhusudan, Trivikram. We chant these names, Vasudeva, Shankarshan, Pradyumna, Aniruddha, and the extended Achman. Who are the Chaturvyuha? What are they about? What's the difference between Shankarshan and Vasudeva and Aniruddha and Pradyumna? Why do they appear extensively? Well, there's a section in the Chaitanya Charitamrita where they describe the Chaturvyuha. There's a section in the Bhagavatam where there are prayers to each of Vasudeva, Shankarshan, Pradyumna, and Aniruddha. Some places they're referred to as psychological principles. So, let's just take a few minutes to discuss this. I'm still exploring this, I'm still learning about it, trying to understand it. Bhaktivinoda Maharaj has spent a lot of time engaging with the Chaturvyuha and the implications for management. And so, when we talk about Shakti as power, and there is, it's worth spending a little time here. Shankarshan, Lord Balaram, manifests as, well, so the material nature is the material nature, but it is invested with Krishna's power. If you remember in the second canto, the description of the creation, where the elements have no potency. So Brahma's trying to create, and he's combining things, and they just don't hold. They don't work out. And then Krishna manifests his potency within them. And so these four potencies then, they they endow the material nature with different qualities. And so Shankarshan is the basis. In Vrindavan, Balaram expands as Krishna's flute, as Krishna's goatee, as Krishna's shoes, as Krishna's stick. It's all Balaram. In the material world, the material nature, the stuff, the hard wood, the stone floor, the physical energy that things are made for, that is endowed with the potency of Shankarshan. Sometimes also there's a description about Shankarshan as gravity, holding things together, keeping things in place. So our bodies, our senses, but we can expand this. Our buildings, our cars, our hardware, it's all the potency of Shankarshan. Shankarshan provides stability, he provides strength. In Krishna's pastimes, Balaram, he establishes peace. He's there as Krishna's support. He reestablishes the peace when Krishna insults Rukmi. He doesn't kill him because Rukmi is saying, please don't kill my brother. Krishna says, all right, I won't kill him. Let me give him a haircut instead. And he just snips a bit from here and a bit from there and makes this Rukmi a proud prince look. Well, he looks like the one. Like the one. And then it's Balaram who comes and consoles Rukmi. It's Balaram who makes the peace. When the Yadavas are enraged and they want to go to confront the Kauravas who have imprisoned Shamba, Krishna's prince, Krishna's son. Remember this? Shamba goes and kidnaps Viradad's daughter, Lakshmana. He's a troublemaker, Shamba. He's also the one who dresses up as a pregnant girl and goes to the stage and says, will it be a boy or a girl? That's Shamba. So the Yadavas, they're all enraged, they're ready to go and do battle with the Kurus and rescue Shamba. And Balaram says, wait, let me go and make peace. Let's talk, let's discuss. So Balaram, the peacemaker, the creator of stability, but his potency is seen in all things, all energy. We can see it. We call our mridangas Balaram mridangas. The fiberglass mridanga, right? The fiberglass Balaram mridanga. And we think only of Krishna's paraphernalia as Balaram. But there's a sense in which we can see all energy, all physical things, as endowed, yes, it's material energy, but it is endowed with the potency of Krishna as Shankarshan. Managers, they move matter. They interact with physical resources, buildings, machinery, hardware, trucks, cars. It's an aspect of management. And a Vaishnava manager can see that this is Krishna's energy, and the potency here is Shankarshan. Vasudeva. Vasudeva Krishna. He rules the intelligence. When we talk about organization, strategy, organizational processes, systems. I've already gone to the management context. Vasudeva is the intelligence that we use to live, to make rational choices, decisions in life. In the organizational context, we extend this as strategy, as process, as systems. Jarasandha attacked Krishna 18 times. It says there's 17. Mistake. 18 times. And the very first time that Jarasandha attacked Krishna, Balaram caught him, had him as a prisoner. Krishna, I got him. Krishna says, let him go. What? This is the troublemaker who attacked Mathura city. You've had to create a new city in the sea and transport everyone over there. We finally got him. Let him go. Why? Because it's a strategy. We have appeared here at the request of the demigods to confront the demons, the demoniac forces that are appearing in the royal families. The demons are cunningly planning to colonize the universe using the earth first as a base. They're appearing in the royal families, and we have appeared to destroy them. If we release Jarasandha, he'll keep bringing them to us, and we can fulfill that purpose. So let him go. Yeah, so an example of Krishna's strategy. His killing of Kalyavana. We also see a nice example of strategy there. He remains just ahead of Kalyavana, the barbarian. This is an aside, just because it's fun. Who are the Yavanas?
Turks.
Huh?
Turks.
The Turks? The Turks or the Greeks?
Combination both.
Okay, both. Alright. So Kalyavana, a king, right? Leading read the Sanskrit, a Yavana army attacking Dwarka. Anyway, that's just an aside. So apparently a Greek army or a Greek-Turk army invades during Krishna's time, attacks Mathura, and later on, yes, they kept coming and they ruled India for a couple of hundred years, but that's another story. So Krishna kills Kalyavana by leading him into a cave where Muchakunda is resting. Krishna wants to wake up Muchakunda, but whoever does so, Muchakunda is going to burn to ashes with his gaze. And so Krishna enters this cave, Kalyavana sees somebody lying there, kicks him. Muchakunda opens his eyes, Kalyavana gets disintegrated, and then Muchakunda sees Krishna and says, "Who are you?" Muchakunda surrenders to Krishna, circumambulates him, heads off to Badri to practice bhakti and go back to Godhead. So, why am I telling these stories? Just as examples of Vasudeva as the strategist. We could give more examples, but just to help us understand this Vasudeva principle. Vasudeva as the intelligence. And so when we are engaging, establishing systems and processes and strategy, that's Krishna. That's Krishna as his Vasudeva feature. Remember that implication that we were discussing earlier, 4 implications of understanding that everything's Krishna's energy? The 4th one that was on that list, it said that you'll never be apart from Krishna. Yeah? So here, we're going in deeper to say, well, this is how we are never apart from Krishna. All physical things are endowed with the potency of Shankarshan. All intelligent processes, planning. This is the potency that we are engaging here with is Vasudeva. Pradyumna. Pradyumna is the sense objects, the objectives. Cupid, the transcendental Cupid that attracts. Do organizations have goals? Do organizations have missions? Do organizations have objectives? What are they attracted to then? They're attracted to, we are attracted to Krishna. That is his potency as Pradyumna, the attractor, or Krishna's name itself means the all-attractive. And finally, Aniruddha, described as related to the mind. The mind is engaged in processes of accepting and rejecting, but essentially the mind is looking for satisfaction, for an experience. And so Aniruddha is that experience. We have goals and objectives, but the goal and the objective is supposed to provide an experience. I'm going to read that book, that's my goal. But my goal is actually Aniruddha, the experience that I'll get from reading the book, from seeing the film, from hearing that song, from tasting that food. So the objective appears to be the food. I'm going to go and have lunch, but really it's the experience, Aniruddha, that we are seeking. And so within organizations, what's the experience? How do people feel? Are people satisfied? Are people happy? Are people healthy? Is there flourishing? Is there well-being? That satisfaction is the potency of the Lord as Aniruddha. And I had great insight recently working with the Sydney Temple, re-evaluating the mission of the temple. They had a mission statement that is quite uninspiring. Has to be explained at length to people because it requires a purport to make sense of. Although very simple, but so then we just re-evaluated that and then started to work out trying to understand how we could recraft the mission statement of the temple, one that's more inspiring. And as we were engaged in that brainstorming process, somebody said, we are in the business of providing uplifting spiritual experiences. That's what we do. We have kirtan, we have programs, we have prasadam, we distribute books, we do all of these things. But what transforms people is the experience of bhakti. Something happens and there's a change from that experience. And so in the end, the mission statement crafted was, we are a caring community that connects people to Krishna through uplifting spiritual experiences. 2 days later, I was sitting in a writing workshop, and the person there at the front of the room who's worked with all kinds of successful writers for film and for print said, you writers, when you write, what you're actually doing, you need to give your reader an experience, and you need to achieve that within the first few lines, otherwise you've lost your reader, they'll go on to something else. So you need to create an experience in the very first lines. And I was like, it reinforced for me that insight that had generated or emerged from our engagement, that experience. Aniruddha. Experience is what people see. We think it's a book, we think it's food, we think it's this and that and the other thing. It's an experience.
The objects are represented by prabhu. The book would be prabhu.
Yeah.
In the ultimate sense, the book is Sankarshan, that represents an energy, Krishna, but then
Okay, physical thing.
understood in our own context.
As a goal, something that we're seeking to, a target that we're aiming for.
And it's Pradumna, but Aniruddha is that our actual experience.
Yeah, very good.
And so this mantra, I don't know any mantras for any of these expansions.
Yeah.
So is Vasudeva considered like a pivot of this whole arrangement because that's our intelligence?
Yeah. So some of you will see a correspondence to Sambandha Adidaya Prayojana. You'll see a correspondence to Manu Mohan, Govinda, Gopinath, but then we get an additional, a fourth, and that's the experience. And So the central figure Govinda, the practice of devotional service, that's where most of our interaction and engagement lies. We're striving to Gopinath, but it's Govinda, the master of the senses, that we engage with. That's Vasudeva. Thank you. Yeah?
It's an interesting parallel how Bhakti-Purna Maharaj makes Sambandha Videya and Prayojana. Then we have 4 aspects of Chaturvyuha, so where to put the 4th one? Because it's obvious that Sankarshan is in Sambandha.
Yep.
Then Aniruddha is in Prayojana. And then what connects them is Vasudeva. But then somehow or other he puts Pradyumna in the aspect of Sambandha Jnana, but not the external or mechanical aspect, but the mood. Because then in experience we have 2 things happening. It's to get a complete experience, full experience, that we need something tangible that comes from Sankarshan. But if the mood is wrong, still we get the material result, something tangible, something mechanical. But then the emotional satisfaction without Pradyumna being involved in Sambandha Jnana, it's not there. So that's how he put it like that.
Yes, very good. Thank you. So you've reflected on this a lot more than me, and I appreciate you sharing those nuanced insights. From this, what I would hope that you'll take from it is we're building on this idea that everything is Krishna's, it's part of Krishna. Here are practical ways in which everything is Krishna's and part of him, and in terms of how we organize, essentially from an organizational point of view. You have things, you have processes, you have a product that you're selling or targets that you're trying to reach, and then you have the experience that you're creating within the organization and outside of the organization. It's a complete model. It's a complete model. It's a, once again, most profound model as well. Yeah?
I'm just thinking, as you said, this in a Trotting Christie way with things, process, targets, experience, we're looking at Krishna's victory. Any really successful company will have these representations, like Apple. They sell an experience also, right? Not just like a product.
That's right.
Thing. So if you're looking at whatever is victorious, there must be Krishna Shakti in there, otherwise it wouldn't be victorious. And if they have been sometime victorious, and then they're not longer, then they went away from Krishna's potencies.
Okay.
And had their own thing going on, right? It's interesting.
Yeah, thank you for that further insight. Yes, Patrick, Prabhu.
Thank you very much. I appreciate this powerful tool and the way to think. It's very powerful for the leaders, after understanding this, to appreciate the different ways and innovations and creativity of preaching and come out from the box of only believe Hare Krishna or whatever something. And for the preacher, it's very, very powerful tool to think more broadly, text the brain and, to expand the horizons. The sky's the limit so many ways. And very often I was kind of personally myself was misunderstood, like in some countries. When I came, I don't know language, and I was doing pantomime and the different stuff. Yeah. So it's not much difference, what are you doing? But amazingly enough, at the end of the day, you get so many people attracted and eventually became devotees. But the way of this, I think I'm experience, what we provided to the people, that experience which they didn't have with this traditional Orthodox approach. And of course, it's not going to continue forever, but if we are a little creative and broad-minded, I didn't know that, because I didn't know what to reply sometimes to people, philosophically. But it's very powerful tool for the preacher, to philosophically to make people understand that this is everything Krishna, provided this to Krishna.
Yes. Yeah, very good. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that you're seeing the practicality of it and you're sharing with us the practicality of this model as a tool. Any other thoughts? Okay, yesterday when we were discussing power, we discussed different types of power relations. Power over, power to, power with, power within. And an implication there is that power over is bad, power to is okay, power with is good, power within is excellent. So one thing that sociologists will say is that all human relations are power relations. And in Western society, because of our concern about power over, domination and control, our reticence towards our bad experiences with domination and control as exploitation, then for the most part we have come to accept friendship rasa, or friendship relations, as positive, conjugal relations as positive, but anything then you have professional neutral relations, that's okay, but the servitude, the paternalism, that's problematic. In Australia we have a term that's used to address anyone and everyone from the Prime Minister to the taxi driver, and it is mate. Thanks, mate. Excuse me, mate, you know how to get to the... In Australia, everyone's mate. Are you familiar with that expression? Mate. Excuse me, mate, what's the time? Excuse me, mate, can you left my phone to make the call? Everything's mate. Getting on the bus and mate, how's it going? Mate means friend. And Australia's founding was to get away from the European classism. We go and start a new, well, okay, there was the convict aspect, that's part of the story, but there were free settled cities as well. Adelaide, for example, was a free city where people left Europe, they went to Adelaide, they went to New Zealand to settle there, to create an egalitarian society where everyone's equal. Russia attempted the same with Lenin, with communism, to create an egalitarian society. So in Russia, under communism, we're all comrades, and in Australia, we're all mates, we're all friends. And even in the conjugal relationship, even in the relationship between lovers, for the most part it comes towards, in Western society today, it's about friendship as well. We're mates. And the reason for this is because of a concern around exploitation, power exploitation. If I'm a servant to somebody, no way. So we're reticent towards being put in a subordinate role. So we try to bring it all to an equal level of the Australian value of even extend my Australian accent, the Australian value of mateship. Something that the Prime Minister will talk about in his Christmas address. Somebody wants to become a citizen, they have to conform, or they have to develop the Australian value of mateship, where we are all equal and friends. And what we lose here are the other flavors of rasa. So Krishna, rasa, vaisa. Krishna is the embodiment of loving relations. And these relations have different flavors, different colors, different textures. And these flavors, these colors are, yes, neutrality, also the servant to master relationship. There's a sense of protection that's felt in serving a benevolent master. But we lose that. There's a sense of protection and satisfaction which comes from the relationship of parental affection, from the parents to the children, from the children to the parents. I love watching, sometimes when I'm waiting at the airport in Delhi or Kolkata, people arriving off the plane. So you see a lot more of these different relationships. Children greeting their parents, they'll touch their feet, and the parents bless them. You never see that in the West. We're mates. Me, my mother, my dad were good mates. But in the Vedic culture, there's that relationship of bowing down to one's parents in the Asian culture. Bowing down to one's parents and receiving that blessing and the satisfaction that comes of that relationship. So we can keep that in mind. This is also Krishna's energy, and Krishna has these relationships. He enjoys these relationships. That there are power dynamics, power implications, and in the West, because they have been exploited and abused, masters not treating their subservients properly, parents not treating their children properly, husbands not treating their wives properly, and we try to eliminate these relationships, and we come to a single standard of mateship or camaraderie, and we lose because of power, because of concern around power abuse, and so we lose the flavor of different types of relationships. And so yesterday's talks, we spoke about power and power dynamics and abuse and control and the importance of critical thinking and resistance. But the conclusion from a Vaisnava perspective is not to eliminate power, not to eliminate power relations. It's not possible anyway. As communism tries, as mateship tries. But rather to enter into these relationships in a mood of, what you said, benevolence. In a mood of love, in a mood of respect. Seeing everyone as part and parcel of Krishna, everyone as Krishnas. Then when we interact with them as in a parental relationship or as a master or whatever the case may be, it's in a mood of respect. But in that respectful role, it may be providing protection as a master or as a parent or whatever the case may be. So, yes, we try to, in the West for the most part, I don't know how it is in America, definitely in Australia, mateship, that's the standard. Nonetheless, these different relations do exist, it's just that they get flattened. They get divested of their character, of their potency, of their potential. And yeah.
In the beginning of Srimad Bhagavatam, it's right in the first canto, one of the first purpose he gives, the long purpose, he mentions all the rasas, the 12 rasas, and then he says, unfortunately, living entities in the material world, they never experience the primeval rasas. It's all about secondary rasas. And then now you're saying that even that experience is flattened.
Right.
So for example, if you take friendship, it's basically hasyarasa, it's laughter. It's not friendship as such. It's that very superficial,
Right.
and then even that is,
Right. Yeah, very good. Thank you. So even that equal playing field of friendship, it's not real friendship.
no.
It's just a platform where we say we're equals, so don't try to impose power on me. You have no right to do so, even, whatever the case may be. And so I guess it's even nudging towards neutrality.
Yeah, it's a secondary within the secondary. So it's very limited.
And we could go on with this. If there's no flavor, if there's no depth in relationships, then how are we as a person, where are we getting our experience, our satisfaction in life, our self-concept? There's all kinds of psychological distresses that would extend from not having any depth in relationships. But that's a whole other discussion.
I kind of have a question.
Please.
I'm a little intrigued, actually I'm a lot intrigued by where you're going, where you're heading. You take a lot of really powerful information, and this one on power dynamics is, as I'm hearing you, I'm thinking, okay, it sounds like you're speaking of management from a perspective of, like, somebody explained in the seventh to an ideal human being, which I'm a little torn.
Okay.
Does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
Okay.
We always need to have the ideal, right? So we aspire towards an ideal. I guess there's always that tension between the ideal and the real. And so often we'll settle for the real and we say, that's all that's possible, we're just going to stay with that. And then we stop striving towards an ideal. Whereas our process in Bhakti Yoga, maybe it's the other extreme, striving so much for the ideal that we no longer recognize the real. But there is a resolution, there is a synthesis here. And that is that we maintain the ideal, but we acknowledge what we are realistically capable of, and we incrementally make progress towards that. And that's clearly what Krishna teaches Arjuna in the Gita. He says, Arjuna, understand what your adhikara is, what your qualification is. Don't try to do everything all at once. So the ideal remains as it is, but then there's an acknowledgement of what we are realistically capable of achieving. Yes, sorry, Raj.
I was thinking, in line with what you explained previously, looking at everything as part of Krishna's plan, that we see historically, the power of the clergy also being deflated. That's why we have secular systems, and this is like historically this was the top power which was influencing monarchy and everything else. And then it's interesting how Prabhupada explained in one class that secular system is actually good in principle because it's neutral, it's not promoting one religious tradition over the other, but the secular leaders supposed to be not supposed to be ignorant, they're supposed to know the principles of spiritual development and promote these principles regardless of the tradition. So I was thinking that this whole dynamics in the society when the powers were taken away from those who have used the powers, and now there is a call for equality, equal rights and everything else, and then it's supposed to lead to real kind of relationships if we move into the development of the golden age, which is supposed to be happening. So any thoughts on this?
My thoughts are that the default mechanism, the default setting that we have now of equality and friendship it's a starting point, and if we can't engage in these other relations with respect and love, then we should go back to that neutral default setting of equality. That's I guess a safe ground. We're losing a lot. We're losing the richness and the texture and the flavor of life, of experience. If we can't do these other things without being abusive and exploitative, we have to come back to that safe point for the time being. But as we develop as spiritual beings and as a spiritual community, we should be able to have these richer relationships in these other moods and flavors as well. And that would be a symptom of our advancement as a spiritual community. One reason why I'm presenting this is from yesterday. It might appear that we're advocates of anarchy and zero power relations, trying to eliminate power relations altogether, which isn't possible. Or you might be left from yesterday with a sense of being unsettled. Well, what do you do? We understand the power dynamics all around us. We understand how we're being influenced and so on. Where do we go from here? And so why we're discussing this is to say, well, our teachings do have responses, they do have answers, and they are profound. They are incredibly profound. And we may not be able to get there yet, but having an awareness of these aspects, having an awareness and a striving, be able to paint a picture, a vision for a positive alternative. Yeah?
I'm wondering, sometimes we hear that things become more tribal or like a family. So this kind of like a family. And how would you see these 5 rases in a family today? I mean, it's not just the Vaisnava between sons or sisters and daughters and parents, but also like between brothers and sisters. There might be relation, or uncles, aunts, and all that. And now in Native American spirituality, that's more a way of relations. I don't know that much about it. I just heard it many times. They always speak about all my relatives, all the beings are my relatives. And so I've heard them speak like that. And we bring that the company will never be a family. It's impossible. But Germany was considered to be like a big family with one father, which was Adolf Hitler. And they were very successful in that. And everyone was relating to each other based on these races. Not the majority so much, but you can see the power in that. Or this felt more like a family in the early stages. The first few years when the Hare Krishna explosion happened, that was a family. 68, 69, 70, and then it stopped to be a family. More and more so, and then it became something else. So, did you study that a bit, or what are your thoughts, or just bring it out there in terms of like how power dynamics in a family doesn't lead to exploitation maybe so much, or preventing it more. Also, look at the Pandavas as a family. Even Vidura as the uncle actually helped the Pandavas to survive while he was the most trusted brother, or like confident of Dhritarashtra about the enemy's plans. And all that. So it's since you went so deep into this power dynamics relation.
Sure. So in relation to the family, I can say that the literature looks at, there's a critical management studies literature that looks at the family in organizations and the blurring of the boundaries between work and play as a tool of soft power, control, and exploitation, but on the other hand, as mentioned earlier, as a way of engendering motivation and commitment and additional effort. And so, there are positives and negatives to this. And once again, it comes back to attitude. The attitude or the objective that we bring to these relationships, and that's where the concern. That's when we become averse to it, when we can see that the attitude of creating a family is to exploit. And we say, okay, let's get it back to neutrality or friendship at best. On the other hand, if it can be done with sincerity, to cultivate and build those relations, even within the organizational context, it can be a beautiful thing. One other reason for presenting this model is I guess for us to get a sense that we read about Krishna's different relationships, Shanta, Dasya, Vatsalya, and then we think that only applies to Krishna, different ways of interacting with Krishna. But if we understand how these relations are all around us, and the power implications to those relations, we'll have more nuance and sensitivity in our interactions and engagements with others. So, another powerful tool given to us in our Vedic culture and teachings that we can use in service. Yeah.
I was also thinking that this kind of structure is, can just remembering how Bhaktivedanta Maharaj makes this distinction between two types of varnashram. One is asuric and another one is Daiva varnashram. And asuric varnashram is all about positions and powers and benefits and selfish. But then Daiva varnashram is about serving and caring and respect. All the positives. And if you look at these rasas through the lens of Daiva varnashram, as it is depicted in Bhagavatam, actually the leaders, the kings or the brahmanas, they were, perceiving everyone through the lens of Shanta rasa, meaning that they treated everyone equally as parts of Krishna, and therefore they were, exhibiting the best example of Dasya, serving everyone as parts of Krishna, and then that in turn helped their subjects to trust them and develop friendship. And Vatsalya, the mood of care, was developing through that. And
the Raja is called Raja, with the citizens of the Praja, the children.
Yeah. And Madhurya is the mode of self-sacrifice that, leaders were sacrificing themselves for the sake of people, and people were able to sacrifice themselves for the sake of leaders and for each other. So this proper mentality was, coming down from the leaders, and it was creating the right atmosphere in which all the rasas were flourishing. Unfortunately, the influence of Kali Yuga is that it's, the tendency for abuse is very strong.
Thank you, Maharaj. So Maharaj has just taken this analysis to a whole other level, saying that within the same relationship, there will be times when you act more like a friend, other times you're acting more like a a teacher or a master, other times you're more like a friend, other times you're acting, so different types of relations, more neutral, different types of relations within the same relationship, but you're drawing on these different flavors as is appropriate to a given context. And a leader who's able to do that will be incredibly successful, incredibly effective. As you said, I remembered a description from my father, who was a teacher in the Gurukula in Australia, in Uganda. And I remember him describing his role as a teacher, and he was saying, sometimes I have to be more like a master and instruct the children, other times I have to be there as their friend and play with them, other times I have to be more like a parent and be concerned and caring in that way for their physical needs. And so that takes us to a whole other dimension, understanding these different types of relationships and how they nurture the individual in different ways. Is another powerful tool that you can draw upon as a resource. And I have in the back of my mind, because the literature in management, the management literature doesn't go into these relations, workplace relations, in any depth very much at all. And at some I have an intention to write a paper, because we're always needing to produce research and publications. I have an intention to do some kind of analysis based, using this framework. I won't refer specifically or necessarily to the Vedas, it just won't work for me in the context that I'm in. But I do have an intention to use this because it is a powerful framework. It is a powerful model.
I recollect one statement from scriptures, I think also mentioned in Bhagavatam, that in some Puranas explained that somebody who has no one to serve, to make friendship, and to give mercy to, so this bhakti will be incomplete. Basically, that's, I can give my reference.
Very good. Yeah.
That's very important. If leader, he doesn't have relationships with equals, or he doesn't have someone above him, to be respectful and to have the service attitude, and to be merciful or parent or whatever. So somebody who is to give mercy to Madhyama level. We can, as one of the senior devotees explained, that sometimes in our organization we have Gates syndrome. Kanishta so syndrome. So it's very important for leaders also to have this kind of association and ability to see different levels in order to experience Aniruddha, complete bhakti.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you.
Yes,
Yeah, please.
I had a conversation this morning with a devotee, and this devotee said something really profound. I was just talking about the organization, and we spoke about ISKCON, and he said, which ISKCON? Which ISKCON are you speaking about? There are so many aspects of ISKCON. And so as you're sharing these managerial principles, and as you're sharing this one specifically on power dynamics, for me, I was thinking that this, as you're sharing it, is a tool. I can only apply this tool intrapersonally at this point, because as a counselor, when I think of all the dynamics, all the things that goes on with people in our organization, for me this just seems really a little foreign, because I see the groundwork of where people are and their experiences. So yeah, intrapersonally, yes, I can work on this for me.
Organizationally, what would you think? What would you see needs to be?
Well, this, like I said, this first foundational understanding of what is this going? What is our organization? And how if we don't really even know what our organization is. We're fragmented, obviously. So how can, anyway, it's just my thoughts. It's just all over the place right now.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Our next session will talk about culture, organizational culture, and I guess that has relevance to something that you just raised there. And so we'll get to deep dive into that topic. in our next session. Yeah.
Comment on the whole area of subject matter, because one time I was speaking with the Protestant community, and we were talking about all the glorious temple, but the often sometimes remember that the temple is actually a hospital to receive people, and I think this is an important part for all of us to remember, is that we're here to take medicine, we're trying to get well from the material disease, and I think when dealing with people, not saying all people are sick, not
Yep.
one of the people being sick, but remembering that we're all trying to get better, like we're all trying to get closer to Krishna and trying to follow the system properly. So I think when staying in that mood and remembering that the goal is to get well, to become Krishna, very conscious of Krishna, then dealing become a lot easier to like go through by people. People like thinking about actually how to help people advance, not
Yep.
use that power to minimize negativity or positivity. I think it happens a lot of ways to glory to remember that what like the system is there to help us stay in place, but we're all spiritual, trying to go back to the system. And I think that's
So, being compassionate rather than judging others for what they're not. Being compassionate and working towards providing support. Thank you. Yes?
The foundation which allows these relationships to express themselves ideally is when there's a sense of common purpose. And when you brought that example of Australia, that's what I was thinking, is that although it has its many shortcomings, at least there is a universal sense of purpose in the people at large, which allows actually for then these other things to be expressed in some way, which is healthy and stable. And if anyone has seen the recent New York Times article about the situation in Brooklyn Temple, the writer characterized it so amazingly well, and in a way that I wonder how many of those that identify as part of the Krishna conscious society we would be able to, that we're suffering from a lack of identity and purpose. It's straight out of Prabhupada's purport, chapter 2, text 63. That disturbance in the mind is due to a lack of a sense of a goal. And so this relationship structure, which is expressed purely in the spiritual world, is allowed to be expressed that way because that foundational purpose, Krishna. And then the idea of that is service, and the prayojan of that is intimacy. And I'm really grateful that you've taken a whole session, maybe even more, to connect so beautifully our Vaishnava frameworks to their perverted reflections in the world. It's something that, as this course can be more widely accepted in other parts of other ISKCONs,
Right.
if this hard work is done a little bit more. So thank you for doing it.
My pleasure. Thank you for your appreciation. And I'm inspired interacting and engaging with you and having these discussions. And being able to share and to get your insight as well, because it also builds my understanding and realization. The point Patri Prabhu was making about the necessity for a Madhyama Adhikari, for a mature Vaishnava, to have relationships, these varied relationships, is one that comes up. So particularly when a senior devotee is unable to practice anymore, people say why, and they'll say, well, they didn't have friendship anymore. They were just in that master relationship, and not that they were bowing to anyone else, but that people were bowing to them. And so the importance of having people that we offer our respectful obeisances to as a servant, people that we have friendship with, and then people also that we extend our care towards as a dependent, is something that comes up when devotees struggle, particularly senior leaders, that part of why they've gone off track is because they weren't cultivating these different types of relationships with devotees. I've had that conversation many times, but I never looked at it in relationship to this framework, and so I'm really grateful for that insight. Okay, we will conclude conclude there, regrouping at the regular time, and we will carry on. As promised, our next topic will be managing cultures. Thank you all so much. Hare Krishna. I hope you enjoyed your lunch, had a restful or productive break as needed. We're moving into a second topic, and that is managing cultures. I lost my plural there. And so this is an idea that we will discuss first with definitions, and then we'll talk about whether or not it can be managed. Some different perspectives on what an ideal culture would look like. And then some critical arguments about the value of a strong culture before we draw some conclusions and look at some Vaisnava perspectives as well. Culture is an idea that we borrow from anthropology. Yesterday we discussed how management is in fact a new discipline. It's not like philosophy or literature, language, which has an ancient tradition. Management relatively new, and so part of what management does is borrows ideas from other discipline areas. Sorry, I'm going to take this back. Management appropriates some of the best ideas from psychology, from sociology, from cultural anthropology, and makes it their own. And so this is one of those ideas that management has appropriated. In cultural anthropology, then an anthropologist will study a culture. They will observe what are their rituals around food, how do they what are the characteristics of their language, what is unique about their architecture, what are the meaning used in different symbols. And so a cultural anthropologist will observe traditionally, come to India or Africa, try to embed themselves in a village somewhere, some society, and try to embed themselves in such a way that they become invisible. Invisible in the sense not that they're wearing an invisibility cloak, but that people become so accustomed to them that people don't see them as any way disrupting their regular affairs. So the anthropologists can just note and observe and study this unique culture without influencing it. That's the concern of an anthropologist at home. If I'm present and observing, immediately now I'm changing that thing that I am observing, and so that would be in some way a contamination of the data. And a cultural anthropologist would first try to build relationships, and to become, after a period of time, people just become accustomed to them being there, and so they stop acting and they start to just perform as per normal. That's historically how culture is studied. So we have a definition here. Culture defined as patterns of shared understandings and meanings that a group of people will use to make sense of their environment values, shared ways of doing things, a shared understanding of what are the rules that should be observed, and shared norms of behavior. Taking these together and observing what's unique about them, and then saying, this is such and such, these are the characteristics of such and such a culture, of North Indian culture, or South Indian culture, or Bengali culture. So this idea then gets carried into the organizational context, where it is defined as organizational culture, the deep, basic assumptions, beliefs, values that define membership within a particular organization. The ways people in that organization habitually make decisions and represent themselves and the organization. There's an important assumption here being made. And I've hinted at it in my, I don't know if you've picked up a little bit of a cynical tone in my voice or not. I'll try to cover it a little bit. What's the assumption here? Yeah?
That this is consciously done.
That it's consciously done? Okay, good. Yeah, very good. Excellent. Would anyone like to expand on that?
Is it that organizations try to create their own culture within the group?
Yeah. There's an assumption that we, as members of organizations, can create a unique culture that specifically defines us as Googlers. That specifically defines us as Microsoft or Apple or whatever the case may be. And that we have this unique culture that has been carefully engineered. Taylor, that has been consciously engineered by our leadership. So, the assumptions are, whereas anthropologists study an existing culture, trying not to influence it, just to observe a pristine culture and describe it as it is, managers assume that we are going to shape, we are going to mold, we are going to craft a unique culture that speaks to the needs of our organization, our customers, or whatever the case may be. The question is, can it be done? You're suggesting that yes? Yeah? Okay.
You can create guidelines and attract matching personalities.
So you can create guidelines and then try to find people that fit
Yes.
to your managerial guidelines.
Like it's
And
easier
induct
than
them.
changing people.
And induct them into the organization instead of what?
Easier than changing people.
It's easier than changing people. Yeah. So easier than changing people according to what we want them to be. You fire. You fire those that don't fit your mold, and you get new people who do fit your mold, so that you can have your, or at least as close as possible to your designed, predefined cultural characteristics. Yeah, that's, organizations do that. Certainly. I'm not sure that they're able to achieve what they're hoping to achieve by doing that, because you fire half your people.
You don't fire, but you create an environment where they will not be able to exist. Like, not in a bad way, but for example, if a person is not honest, then you're speaking. I don't want it to come off as
It says a lot. So okay, so you wouldn't fire them.
For example, if we're like, if in your environment honesty is appreciated and dishonesty is not appreciated, then you don't encourage dishonesty.
Yeah.
Therefore, dishonest people will not be able to exist properly.
So
The way
they'll voluntarily want to move on because of the change that you've made, where you really reward honesty and you punish dishonesty, and you'll make it an environment that either they change or they move on. Okay, that's one approach. The firing of half the people, that is another approach. Organizations definitely adopt that. And it is, how could that be problematic? Yeah.
Well, natural question comes, what to do in volunteer organization like us? You can't fire people.
That's right.
But very often you can find them there of different group blood, not to be mixable at all. Sometimes. Not because they're bad, but because they have different group blood.
Yeah.
And basically why they're mixing in the kind of aswajatiya, and there's definitely no snidam, there's no loving feeling or something like that.
Yeah.
So you can fire them, and well, you can adjust with them, of course, somewhere, but the efficiency will be not as it would be with the implementation. What would be practical suggestion?
Let's ask the room.
Yes.
So if we were to apply Dennis's approach, we create parameters in which they find this uncomfortable to be there anymore. Maybe they'll go and form their own group, or you find another place for them.
Well, everybody following Pakka standard. Everybody, sometimes they're very Pakka in their performance. There's nothing to change, basically.
Yeah.
But the way of performance, for example, they have different flavor, which is also very much welcome. But whether it's individually or even unit-wise, at different temples they have different styles.
Yeah.
And when, for example, a representative of higher authority comes to the temple to perform his duty, and he has different mood, totally, not like a contemplation of place.
So even different GBCs or sannyasis visiting the temple come with very different moods.
No, we are not targeting at the moment that level.
Right.
But ultimately, we see that it's a bit tattva. So is it like, as a leaders we are supposed to be leaders for the people, or people for the leaders, or we're just fighting people because they're following leader, or it's leaders supposed to empower others so they can stand on their own. So this is actually tattva.
These are the complexities.
Right.
And so that's why this is such a sensitive and important topic to discuss. I don't have a single easy answer for you.
Well, it's definitely a very complex and very, very nice topic.
Yeah.
Whether we can create and twist the hands and make our own culture, or we can revive already already existing universal culture.
Right.
So it's and people have different approaches.
Yeah. Good. Thank you. So I see you're speaking from the pain of experience, the pain and the pleasure of experience, and so you speak to the intense relevance and importance of this topic. So hopefully as we go through, you'll get more insight, more clarity. I don't know that you'll have a single answer solution, but you'll definitely have more understanding of complexities, but even the opportunities that are there. So we'll dive in deeper. Thank you. Okay, let's do our genealogy. Yesterday we did some genealogy in relation to the development of management thinking, management history. And so let's look at the history of this notion of organizational culture. Where did it come from? Has it always existed, or is it something that has emerged in time? And what was the context of this emergence? So when we look to Taylor, he's not at all concerned with organizational culture. There are ways that you can analyze Taylor as creating a particular type of culture, but it wasn't his primary concern or interest, his intention. So Hawthorne studies, if you remember from yesterday, Elton Mayo and his explanation for the productivity rising in the Western Electric factory with changing the light settings. And he said when the social relations in the group are a certain way, when people feel valued, the group feels valued and important, then productivity will rise. So in Elton Mayo, we start to see seeds of this notion then of group values, group understanding, relationships, and so there's seeds of what we refer to today as organizational culture, although he didn't explicitly discuss this topic. Where it really comes into ascendance is in the 1980s in the United States of America. The 1980s are a time where the economies of the developed world are being seriously challenged by an emerging Asia and a reconstructed or a redeveloped Europe. So after World War II, manufacturing in Europe had been seriously disrupted, decimated, factories and the plants. So there was no competition for American domination in that area. Manufacturing of cars and household appliances. And so America became very particularly wealthy in that period, as did the United Kingdom. But with restructuring after World War II in America, in Japan as well, then America starts to face serious competition. And they're looking for answers, they're looking for alternatives, they're looking for new ways of doing things so that they can regain their advantage. And so what happens is significant economic restructuring in the United States under Ronald Reagan, in the UK under Margaret Thatcher, in Australia and New Zealand as well. They follow suit afterwards. And it's a restructuring towards privatization, liberalization of market monopolies or economies. So areas where government had been more involved in regulating and controlling, they privatized those. In Australia, I can give Australia as examples. We've seen this in India in the 90s. So telecommunications, which was previously in Australia, in India, government monopoly, government control. It's a service that the state provides to citizens. It gets deregulated, broken up, sold off to private interests, and it becomes part now of a services economy. So restructuring of the economy towards more services. We have it in aviation. America's not a great example here because you've had privatization for a lot longer, but in other countries, aviation, that was also a government monopoly. Russia is a good example as well. So whereas previously you have a state that owns Qantas or Air New Zealand or British Airways or Aeroflot, and then this gets, the market is deregulated so that many competitors can come in, and the government monopoly broken up, sold off, so that it becomes one of many operators in this area. And so there was a huge shift in the developed world towards restructuring of the economy to create more of this competition and to create less regulation by government, so that there can be more competition in these areas, and hopefully then to bring down the cost and increase the quality. That's the theory. Adam Smith's invisible hand. Competition will create better quality at lower cost to the end user. So this was a major response of the developed world to remain competitive in this era. We've seen India's prosperity since the 90s, since these types of policies have been implemented, this deregulation of the market. We've seen India become very prosperous as well in this past 15, 20 years with this type of policy. So a period of economic restructuring, of market liberalization, of market deregulation. Along with that, they're looking at what is Japan doing, what are these competitors doing so well. And so, particularly in America, they're experiencing serious competition to their car manufacturing. So General Motors and Ford are getting serious competition from Toyota and Honda and Nissan, there we are, Suzuki as well. So these great Japanese manufacturers, they have a lighter, smaller vehicle, but it turns out that these vehicles are made to a very good quality as well. Initially, people had some skepticism towards the quality of Japanese manufactured products, but eventually they come to recognize, actually, not only are they cheaper, but they're actually better. They're better than your Ford, they're better than your GM, they're not as clunky, and why? How can the Japanese achieve this kind of quality? And so as they're asking these questions, and delegations going over to Japan to observe the work that's being done there, they discover that Japanese workers appear to love their organizations. They appear to be emotionally invested in the organization. It's not just a job. They're not just putting tires onto wheels and bolting them onto a car, but they appear to actually care about what they're doing. And that astonishes the American manufacturers, and they say, what's going on? What's the difference? What's the critical difference? And the answer they come to, in terms of these loyal, enthusiastic, committed Japanese employees, the answer they come to is that it's part of the Japanese culture. It's part of the Japanese culture to be committed to, you said earlier, the tribe or the family. There are the traditional samurai values of saving face, of being credible, of being honorable. Yeah, honor, that's the word I was looking for. And it's not part of the American psyche. It is the Japanese psyche. And what Japanese companies have been able to do is leverage this into their organizations, which then contributes to superior output, to superior performance. Yeah? So tapping into the Japanese psyche, tapping into the traditional Japanese values, and leveraging that to achieve superior performance at the organizational level, which then gives them competitive advantage that money can't really buy. You can't pay people to be like that. You can encourage them, but you can't pay people to be that committed, that loyal, that honorable. The question then is, okay, well, that's Japanese culture. What do we have in American culture that we could tap into and leverage? What are the defining characteristics of an American psyche? Yeah, okay. You were once in that
Just to highlight the irony of this particular example, as all this was going on in Japan, was slowly but surely setting up to kick American manufacturing butt in the auto industry. GM especially, General Motors, was creating vehicles with intentional lifespans of only 10 years. So they intended that after 100,000 miles or 10 years, that the car would essentially fall apart. And they assumed, so arrogance would be my answer to your question, they assumed that Americans will just buy another American vehicle and our vehicle also. Because if you're a GM guy, you're a GM guy. If you're a Ford guy, you're a Ford guy. But what they found was that many people got onto these Japanese guys and their cars, which were cheaper, better, in every way from efficiency to looks to reliability.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for offering that insight. The other thing that was found about the American manufactured vehicles is that sometimes the employees would purposefully sabotage the vehicle as a way of expressing their dissatisfaction with the organization. So they'll purposely screw things on backwards, purposely leave out a particular component, just as a way of expressing their anger and their frustration towards their employees. So the exact opposite of what was going on in Japan was a norm in American car manufacturing. We'll talk about a little bit about this, some other examples later. And so American manufacturers then are asking this question, okay, what is it about the American psyche that we can leverage to achieve organizational competitive advantage within our context? And what they conclude is that Americans in particular are mavericks. They like individualism, autonomy. They like to see themselves as somebody who's shooting for success and achieving things, making things happen. These characteristics, so less commitment to the tribe, more individualism. And so the question then is, okay, well, can we leverage that? Can we? Sure. But can we take this and use it to the advantage of the organization? And so that's what American companies start trying to do. You're seeing your job not just as a job, but as a career opportunity. Opportunities for further personal development, for growth, for progression, an opportunity for you to be a star. So your success is the organization's success, the organization's success is yours. And so they start leveraging this into this psyche of the American individualism as an opportunity that organizations can offer their employees. So you're joining the Ford team. you're joining the Google team, and as part of a team member, you're going to be, or you have the opportunity through this to get all this training, to get all this experience, you're going to get all these perks, you're going to get all these opportunities, and you can be a success through this organization.
They even adopted the loyalty principle that if you're a Google employee, you won't get a job at Apple anymore. Vice versa, they have an ethics, they won't hire each other's people.
Okay.
Because they go so deep inside that it would be almost like a breach of confidence.
Okay.
And they don't hire you anymore, so you're stuck with that group then. You join them, truly.
Yeah. I didn't know about that. I didn't know people who've gone from Microsoft to Google.
Well, then there will be, all the CEOs, they have a gentleman's agreement. And they don't do that. If it happens, it's a serious problem. And then Steve Jobs calls for Gates. I mean, this used to happen sometimes, but it's not happening actually.
Okay.
It would be a scandalous thing. So it's within the Silicon Valley, they have these agreements with each other. All of these big companies, all of them, they won't hire each other's people.
Interesting.
Which is another thing that when they get fired, they're screwed. Because they don't get another job in other industries, they have to leave California, you know. So it's another way to control them, also keep them. But it's also to keep their secrets in the company as a confidentiality. But it's also great loyalty.
Thank you. Okay, so this is the book that really put culture on the map. It's called In Search of Excellence. Has anyone read it? Yeah, kind of. Yeah. 3 million copies sold in the first 3 years. A book by Peters and Waterman. It was the book to read in its time in the 1980s when it was released. This was the book that spoke to the secret to organizational success. Peters and Waterman, they were consultants for a big management consultancy firm. Begins with M. McKinsey. Thank you. They were McKinsey consultants. And they were basically given this as a project, but then they took it off on their own and developed their own program. In Search of Excellence. So what they went and did was they interviewed top CEOs and managers from America's 43 most successful companies, as demonstrated by a period of ongoing growth and innovation over a 20-year period. So they look at their performance on the stock market, and they're looking at organizations that have just been growing over 20 years without decline. So you do a survey, the entire stock market, you narrow down, I guess the top 50, but then the top 50 changes year by year. But they narrow down to 43 companies. They say, okay, these are the stars, the highest performers, consistent high performers on the US stock market. And so then they go in to try to discern what is unique about these organizations. And they conclude essentially it's the culture. These organizations have a culture of excellence. They have a culture that is constantly learning because it's close to the customer. So they're always getting feedback from their customers, and that feedback is taken on board, it's integrated into learning systems. Like an airline, for example, every time a plane takes off and lands, the stewards need to make a report of what happened, and that gets fed into a database, it's reviews, and it's constantly advised to make adjustments. In my university, every term you get student feedback surveys. They fill in their survey at the beginning of term or into the second week, and then at the end of term. And we are apprised on the basis of the feedback students are giving, how they're rating us as lecturers. A subject that's consistently getting low ratings gets reviewed, gets changed, adjustments made, change the lecturer, change whatever it is that needs to be done to get improvement there, and to get it above. There's a particular ratio that they're looking to have those feedback responses achieving. So that's a learning organization, a flat, agile, learning type organization that's close to the customer, constantly getting feedback. The other that they saw as a characteristic of these organizations is where teams and individuals have the autonomy to make changes. So I'm getting that student feedback responses. What am I going to do with it? I see it, but my supervisor also sees it. But if I see it, even at my level, I can start making changes. My supervisor might start. So at different levels within the organization, they'll start to make adjustments on the basis of the feedback that's being received or the learning that's coming in. And people are empowered to make those adjustments, to make those changes. Another characteristic of these organizations is that they see people as essential to their success. And so people are not just numbers or cogs that need to be there to make the machine work. As in bureaucracy, this is post-bureaucracy, where we understand that people's motivation, people's trust, people's loyalty, people's commitment, people's initiative, people's walking the extra mile is what makes an organization successful or not. These organizations have defined values that inform decision making. They have, so they're flatter. We were discussing that yesterday. Less hierarchy, less levels of or layers of management, a much flatter structure, a leaner, more agile structure. So as with that learning, autonomy, changes being made at many levels in the organization, not depending on information going all the way up the chain of command to the CEO, where it gets approved and ticked off and then trickles down again. But things are happening all across, cross-channel communication happening within the organization. And this simultaneous loose type properties, that's what we discussed yesterday, that hybrid, where you have bureaucracy and the guidelines providing basic structure, but then there's a lot of agility and malleability in that to make adjustments when needed, as needed. So these were found to be defining characteristics of excellence. This became a Bible. If you were a manager, if you were a CEO in the early 80s, you needed to have that book at least on your shelf to show that you were with it, you were with the times. These are interesting findings, interesting insights, but there are problems with these, with this analysis as well. One problem is that it's overly simplistic. Culture, it's one aspect. It's not the entire. There's so many other things that are important. It's your manufacturing process, your product, your service. There's your supply chain. There are so many other variables. There's the economy, whether it's in an up phase or a down phase. So many other variables that are important. And this book takes culture and makes it the panacea, the silver bullet to solve all organizational problems. Another critique of this book is managerialism. Remember we discussed it yesterday? What was managerialism? How did we define managerialism?
Horse handling?
I beg your pardon?
Horse handling?
Horse handling, okay, that's the derived, the etymology of the word manager. But managerialism speaks to something else. It's an ism, so we have capitalism, communism, socialism. Prabhupada said this ism, that ism. Managerialism. It's a philosophy, an assumption around organizations and the role of management. Remember I told you, students come to the university and somehow they're already infected with managerialism. And so I see it as part of my job to try to disinfect them. Yeah?
As the manager is the sole conductor and influence in this.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. It sees management or the manager as the sole authority, the sole source of good decisions, the sole authority who could make any decision, the architect, the engineer, the supreme Godhead almost.
Doesn't that run a little against those things above there?
Yeah, it does. It does. So one way that we know that this book is managerialistic, it says, okay, so what a manager's got to do is to create this culture of excellence, and the way you're going to do it is this, and the way these organizations have done it. So who did they stick to in there? Remember one of the questions that I said in relation to critical thinking was to ask whose voice is dominant, whose voice is missing, yeah? And so in this book they spoke to CEOs, they spoke to managers. They didn't speak to the others. So those other voices are not heard as such. As an aside then, within 18 months of having written the book, not all those 43 organizations were still performing as well either. That's the nature of the world. So oversimplification would be the main issue here. We kind of addressed this question already. Can organizational culture be changed? And we're having a discussion around, okay, well, yeah, you fire people, or you change the parameters so that people all want to leave, or they change themselves and want to stay. Patri was expressing his frustration even at dealing with some elements that create disharmony within the organization, and how do you address that? What do you do with it? So, yeah.
Srila Prabhupada, he mentions many times in his books that, about cultural revolution. So obviously he wanted to change something.
Okay. Yeah, very good. Did Prabhupada, was he using the word culture in the same way as the way it's used here in terms of organizational culture? The way we generally interpret that quote is, we're going to do great festivals, we're going to have beautiful kirtan and prasadam, and people will be swept up in this Vaisnava culture, and it's going to change the world. So that would be more culture changing others, as opposed to we changing culture. Yeah, any further thoughts?
his perspective it was, but from ours, if we look at it,
Yeah.
then we should change our own culture.
Okay, we should be the engineers to create that. Okay, sure. Purushottam, and then we'll come, there's a few heads. Yep.
If I look into the counterculture, which is still going on in the Bay Area, for example, and it's 50 years matured now, while the counterculture elements of ISKCON are 40 years old and didn't mature along with the rest of the counterculture.
Yeah.
Like in the Bay Area, nobody will use plastic anymore, and we still use it in our festivals.
Right.
So many other still devotees are very health conscious, like in the 60s and 70s, hippies were also. So it seems like that counterculture example is maturing
Yeah.
and changing and adding more elements, while it's not compromising its core values,
Okay.
like environmentalism, for example.
Yeah.
While sometimes it can also create a static situation, whereas the organization stays like this.
Right. Yeah, interesting observation. So you're observing two parallel cultures, the counterculture of ISKCON, which were aligned in the very beginning, and in fact ISKCON spread on the back of the counterculture, all of those networks and channels. And then a divorce in the 80s, perpetrated by ISKCON. We became too important and self-righteous. I think in the 70s to 80s we had lots of money, so we don't need these hippies anymore. And then that continued to develop, and your suggestion is that we've pretty much remained where we were in some ways. The same with the yoga world, it's moved on, so there's other yogis and have moved on as well, and so interesting observation. Yeah.
The culture is based on values, so it's not so easy to change the values. And it can be done by consciously speaking about it and philosophy, but it's quite a process.
Great, yeah, great insight. So culture then is essentially, remember yesterday, Mikhail Foucault, power/knowledge, power-knowledge. Culture is essentially based on our deeply held values, assumptions, worldviews. Those are really hard to change. We do that with the Krishna conscious movement. We learn the Bhagavad Gita, we learn Srimad Bhagavatam, so we're changing the worldview. We're changing those assumptions, we're changing those deeply held beliefs. But organizationally, generally, those things, they're very, very difficult to change. Great insight. Prabhu, and then we'll come to you.
It's interesting that we call it the Hare Krishna movement and the culture of Harinams, and even myself recently traveled in the US. In several airports and even in the streets, people said, "Where are you people? A long time I didn't see you guys." It was an open heart. In the airport, a couple of times we came here. "Wow, I used to sing Hare Krishna. I didn't see you guys for 3 years. Where are you now? Before we used to see you in the streets doing chanting and stuff."
Right.
And it's interesting. I spoke with one senior devotee. He said that nowadays there's kirtans and there's kirtani is outside of ISKCON.
Yeah.
They're even competing in some kind of musical shows, doing kirtans and bhajans. All of them.
Yeah.
But if you can say, people asking, "Oh, you're also chanting Hare Krishna? Oh, you're doing bhajans also? Who taught you these mantras?"
Right.
So Prabhupada's name maybe not even in the picture often, because now culture of kirtan and bhajan, now somebody else entitled with Acharya role in America.
That's right.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
Somebody already owning that name in America, Acharya of Kirtan, somebody else, not Prabhupada.
Yeah, that's right. And part of the reason would be because of we put up walls around ourselves. And so we're not interacting and engaging and networking and being inclusive. And so they move on without us and kind of get left on our own.
I was thinking that culture can be changed in an organization. I mean, given that, yes, it's not so easy, it does take personalities that have values and that are vested in making those changes. One of the things that I've seen not just in our organization, in many organizations, that if we are not able to identify the needs of the organization, because the organization is like a living entity, it is made up of people, but it is alive. If we don't identify the needs of the organization, then it's very difficult to bring to make the changes effectively.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. So it is challenging, it is difficult, possible, but very difficult. It entails great commitment. Do you have a point? No? Okay, so Dennis, and I'll see one other hand here. Okay, Dennis.
If we look at perspective of, from a perspective of like culture, either something that exists or it doesn't exist. Like someone can be cultured or uncultured. So it cannot be changed, it can be introduced and it can be accepted by a group or not accepted.
Okay.
So you can inspire, like encourage new culture, or actually introduce actual culture to an uncultured group. And it can be accepted or not accepted.
Okay. Every group has a culture. It's just whether or not we consider it desirable or not.
Oh, yeah, for example, lead meeting, that's, you cannot call it a culture, it's uncultured, like it's actually uncultured from a perspective.
Okay. From a perspective, okay, so that's where we get into pedantics.
From the absolute perspective.
Right. So culture as in somebody who's cultured and refined because of education and training, that's how you're taking the interpretation. Whereas an anthropologist would define culture simply as what exists, whether we consider it primitive or sophisticated or advanced. So primitive culture or sophisticated culture.
That's my body approach.
Sure. That's just how we use terms. Okay. Good. Yeah.
I think I just think it's very difficult, but spreading over internet. Some of them is inside the they have a job inside the house, and they didn't go to the office.
Yeah.
And I think gradually such kind of people increasing. And if we go to the company and in Japan we have problem like mental problem in the company, and many people commit suicide by the stress from company. So if company avoid to look after such kind of people, I think this kind of organizational culture is destroyed.
This type of destroyed. Okay. So what I'm hearing is telecommuting. Telecommuting is where you work from home. You don't have to go into the job. It's become something that's more and more common today with the internet. So we can do a lot of our work from home. I don't go into work every day. Many days I stay at home and work from the computer. And one of the problems, so the benefits of telecommuting are you're in your own environment, you're relaxed, you don't have to commute so far, there's less of that stress. The challenge with telecommuting, one of the challenges is that you're not integrating and associating with other colleagues, and you're not imbibing the organizational culture through association. And so some organizations like Yahoo, for example, a new CEO came in and said, no more telecommuting. Everyone has to show up at the office at 9 a.m. because we want everyone here in the building engaged and interacting. So yeah, these are some of the issues. We'll take 2 more comments and then we'll keep moving.
I think organizational culture definitely can be changed. I think you covered it just now, how knowledge is power.
Yeah.
So if you kind of inculcate the different knowledge set, then over time it will definitely change the culture of the organization. And if people don't want to change, then naturally they'll be uncomfortable, as you mentioned before. So I definitely think it can be changed.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you all. Just as an explanation, so often at university, I'll put up a question like this and I'll have students go to pingo.upe.de and they'll type in that code, and there'll be 3 responses to that question, yes, no, maybe, or something, and they'll vote using their smartphones. And then the graph will project onto the screen after 2 minutes, and we'll see how many students believe you can change the culture, how many believe you can't, how many are undecided. It's just a way of getting some more interactivity in a large classroom. So that's when you see these slides which say, can do it, rock the boat. That's why. Then it's nicer like this, we're having this discussion here. The internet can be fun though. Better keen though. Here's an interesting statistic that no management consultant would like you to see. 90% of all culture change programs are unsuccessful. That's a dire statistic. It says, as some concluded around the room, yes, culture can be changed, but it's really hard. 10% probability of success. Okay, let's then consider what elements of culture can be changed, which are the, so let's try to chunk this down. One way of dealing with the problem is you break it up into smaller bits and you tackle one bit at a time. So we're going to turn to a model of culture given by Skine, who observes 3 levels of organizational culture. Level 1, artifacts. Level 2, espoused values. Level 3, basic assumptions. Compared to an iceberg, where the artifacts are the tip of the iceberg, that which we see out above the surface of the water, what we assume the iceberg to be, espoused values as the surface level, and then the basic assumptions is actually the body of that iceberg, the largest portion, and it's hidden beneath the surface. When the Titanic, that ship that even God couldn't sink, that's the way they promoted it, when it crashed into an iceberg, it was not the iceberg that could be seen, it was the iceberg that was beneath the surface, that was unseen, that led to the destruction of that ship and the deaths of so many. So artifacts, what are artifacts? In an organizational context, what we describe as artifacts as they relate to an organization's culture. These are the concrete, observable manifestations. So when I say to you, okay, I'm going to say ISKCON. GBC as an artifact? Sure, okay. What else?
From a Vaisnava perspective, Tilak, Tulsi, Sika.
Yeah, good.
Not even though Tilak, those 3.
Sure, okay. So when we see tilak, when we see neck beads, maybe not tilak, not even a sika, but we're downtown, we're in a store, we're in an airport, we see neck beads and we go, hey, Haribol. And the person smiles and says, Haribol. So that's an artifact. Yes, the tilak as well. The neck beads. I was at an academic conference recently and I saw one of the management scholars had neck beads. We sat and we had long conversations. We were very happy in each other's association. So absolutely, these are the concrete, observable manifestations of the culture. What else? In ISKCON. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, all about paraphernalia. You approach a building, you see the flags hanging out the windows, gumshoes and copings, and you see the shoes in front of the door. These are concrete manifestations. You know, oh, that must be the temple. There's all the shoes. You see all the cars coming around all the cars parked in people's driveways and what else? What are the other observable concrete manifestations? Language, yeah, so Sanskrit language.
ISKCON's jargon.
Oh, it's not jargon, so not just the Sanskrit, but terms such as, I didn't want to go there, spaced out, far out. You don't hear it as much, but ecstasy,
Ecstatic.
The TOVP is definitely an artifact, yeah, so a concrete manifestation of an organization's culture. Good, okay, let's move on then. And so let's just discuss this in relation to other organizations that we might be familiar with. Let's go with, I know all the Australian companies, I'm trying to think more globally. Let's go with Apple. Yeah, so the observable manifestations, the artifacts associated with that organization.
Logo.
It's a logo, right? An apple, a silver apple logo, a light in it. There's a particular aesthetic, a type of design. It's the prabhu has a, what is it, an HP or a Microsoft? HP. But there's a particular aesthetic with the, others have started to use it now, but it's the stainless steel surface in the Apple product. The Apple Store, how does it look? Usually big glass panels. There's the uniform that they wear. The geniuses, the genius bar. That's fun. Apple geniuses. There's the wooden surfaces in the store. So all of these things are the external manifestations of an organization's branding. There are colors, there's a font, there's a logo, there's a uniform, there's a particular design aesthetic. Okay, espoused values. These are the beliefs of the organization. What does espoused mean? Yeah, the promoted values, the professed values. My students are so funny. Every time when I ask what is espoused, they're trying to figure it out, so they're just applying logic and so spouse and marriage, marriage, values to which they are married. Anyway, I give them credit for trying. Espoused values, professed values. Any organization, you go to their website and they will have something about their values. We are committed to customer service as our #1 priority. We are committed to integrity, using the highest quality materials. We are committed to punctuality, ensuring that our customers receive their product within such and such a time. So these are the professed values of the organization. We are committed to diversity and inclusion. Every organization has its espoused values, whether explicit or implicit. There are values that are promoted to be the informing frames through which the organization operates. And then finally, level 3, we have the deeply intangible frames, the deep assumptions that subconsciously drive and shape the organization. And often, but these are difficult to see initially, but you scratch beneath the surface and you start to see what's actually going on, and it can be very different from the espoused values. We are committed to diversity and inclusiveness, and then you look at the management level, the makeup of the management, and you'll find that it's all males who are white, from privileged backgrounds, and you say, how does that fit there? There's a conflict between the espoused values and what's actually going on, some kind of bias that favors a certain gender, a certain ethnicity, and so forth. They might say we're committed to punctuality, and yet we find something else, and we say, what's driving that? There's a different set of assumptions. There's a different value set, which is difficult to identify, let alone change. So, what are the espoused values in relation to ISKCON?
Purposes.
Okay, 7 purposes. They are espoused by some. They're there in the front page of the Back to Godhead. Most ISKCON devotees wouldn't know what they were. Yeah, thank you. That's one problem with organizational mission statements. Is that the managers know what the mission statement is, and you talk to people and you ask what's the mission, and people have no idea. In my university, there is a mission statement, and I ask students what it is. Nobody has a clue. Somebody looks it up on the internet, and then they call out the answer. And yet that mission is supposed to represent them. Okay, 7 purposes. What else? What are our espoused values? Yeah.
The ethos of preaching.
Okay. Yeah.
Does sound less.
Service. Yeah. Yeah.
Following the 4 regulated principles.
Sure. Yeah.
Krishna is God.
Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So the whole body of Vaishnava theology, as taught by Srila Prabhupada, these are our espoused values. And then beneath that we have our deeply embedded assumptions. Is there a disconnect between these two? Possibly, yeah. To some extent. To a large extent.
And people have different worldviews, right? Even though we might have the espoused value. And we have different worldviews that comes into people that there may be different worldviews.
Yeah, okay, yeah, good. People have different worldviews. And so although as a society we have our concrete artifacts, we have our espoused values, but then you have people of different worldviews. And that's the bigger part of the iceberg. That's what's driving the culture. And so, yes, we try to change it, we try to reform it, but it's difficult. So let's dig down further here. Artifacts at the organizational level, observable manifestations of organizational culture, physical artifacts, architecture, uniforms, furnishings, symbolic artifacts, logo, brand colors, language, Maharaj mentioned type of language, specific jargon, and the myths. When we say myths here, we don't mean that they're not true, it's just the stories, the narratives. You mentioned narratives yesterday, Purushottam Krishna Prabhu. We have narratives about mythic stories of heroic figures working in a back garage of their auntie and testing, challenging the parameters of what people believe is possible. And on account of their willingness to take risk and push those boundaries, we have the founding of an incredible company such as Apple or Google. Who else? There's another one that was founded out of a garage. Microsoft, was it garage? No. Yeah, so stories of the founder, stories of how this company came to be, and those stories are transmitted, they are communicated, because within those stories there are certain values that are transmitted. Our founders, they were ready to push boundaries. Our founders, they were ready to take risks. Our founders, they were ready, they were innovators. And that is within the DNA of this company. When you come into this company, we expect you to carry on with that ethos, which has made our company successful. To be innovative, to be creative, to challenge the limitations of what people deem possible. Can we change the artifacts? Yes, we can. Organizations do it all the time. You change your logo, you change your corporate branding, you change your uniforms. So it's expensive, but it's definitely doable. Harder it is not. We have all this debate about what people should wear, how they should dress, and what's holy and unholy. We're a volunteer organization. But in the corporate world, yeah, you can change these things rather quickly, easily. Airlines every few years will change their uniform, they'll get some designer in, they'll have a big release of the new uniform, their stewards walking on a catwalk, and with that there'll be a new statement about who we are as a company and what we represent. Can we change our espoused values? Yes, we can. Those statements of our consistent beliefs in the organization, expressed as a mission, vision, or value statement. What's ISKCON's mission statement? So it's suggesting it might be the 7 purposes. Do our members know the 7 purposes? Mostly not. That's a much longer discussion. So mission statements can be motivating and inspiring if they actually represent the values of the members, and there's some vision contained in them, a call to action, or they can be meaningless pieces of paper stuck on the as a slogan on the website or on the wall. Do you have a comment?
No, it's okay. Our mission is to serve Krishna and inspire others to do so.
Lovely. Yeah, nice and concise.
Bruce says that you don't have a power right now. I wanted to take this up into Aspatea. I don't know if everybody here really knows who Kuntea is, but he's one of those silent persons in the background that is really making a lot of changes in this one. Actually, he's been working really, really hard for many years trying to change the culture. And I remember, I don't know if it was a year or 2 ago or 3 maybe, that there was some movement to make a new mission statement for ISKCON from Terry. So was that successful?
I'm not sure I've heard about that initiative. A new mission statement of ISKCON?
Yeah.
Are you sure you're using the exact expression?
I remember you at one of the ILS 3 years ago was going around and creating a group with groups of devotees.
Oh, well, that is something different. It was an exercise to familiarize the devotees with the idea of branding. So it was done, yes, at the ILS, so it was more than 1,000 people analyzing what's the branding of ISKCON, like that. It was not an attempt at changing the mission statement.
So can you tell us what the conclusion there? What is the branding of ISKCON?
Well, there was 1,000 people, right? Yeah. So it was more an exercise to familiarize them with the process of defining, branding, defining how we would like to be seen by others, or how we think others see us. It was an introduction. It was not the whole process.
Okay.
So what I'm hearing you say is that that was an introduction and nothing came out of it. Nothing was finalized from it.
It depends how you define nothing.
If the objective was just to get leaders to start thinking about it, then that might have been achieved.
That was achieved.
People definitely started becoming more familiar with the notion.
What about ISKCON's logo? Does ISKCON Communications has a lotus flower logo with the tilak in the middle? At one point, ISKCON was using an image of Radha Krishna that Prahlad, that they were using in the early 60s, mid-60s. Then we've had in Europe the two swans with the shield that says Atato Brahma Jigyasa, or the shield with the four symbols of Vishnu. That was used in Bhagavan Zone a lot. But I think the manner and other places still use it. ISKCON India used the lotus with ISKCON in the center. You'll see it on the, or we used to see it on the park around Mayapur, the metal grills in the...
Still there.
Is it? Yeah.
Some parts.
Okay. I don't know if we have a final definitive logo.
Well, the official logo is the one with the tilak and the petals.
Okay.
In some places they use it quite consistently.
Right. That's a start, right? Okay, let's get to the basic assumptions. Organizational members' intangible worldviews and beliefs, in brackets, knowledge-power about human existence, concerning the essence of culture, intangible, unconscious, tacit frames that shape the espoused values, that shape the artifacts. Think about the pyramids of Egypt. Why were they built? Yeah.
The oldest ones were mystery school initiation chambers.
Okay.
And also outer space travel and for energy apparently too.
Sure. So, essentially, it's some basic assumptions about the universe that then shape these incredible artifacts. One of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The great pyramids, the great cathedrals of Europe, they're created on the basis of certain worldviews, beliefs about the nature of the world, the universe, creation, life, the afterlife, and it informs human endeavor in the creation of these incredible edifices. And so the same applies to everything. All that we see around us, as in human behavior, human production, is a manifestation of deeply embedded, intangible or not, assumptions about the world, about life, about the universe. Can they be changed? Yeah.
There's this theory about paradigm shifts from Thomas Kuhn.
Yeah.
I think it was from the 70s. And they were saying that you have all these assumptions and so-called facts and whatnot, And this is like the commonly accepted assumption, basic assumption. And eventually there's a growing number of counter-arguments or other facts which are suppressed by those who keep the assumptions, like for vested interest mostly, and power control, all this kind of thing, status quo, all these reasons. And then eventually it only changes when those who keep that, for example the professors teaching history or science, that they speaking die out. The young professors or philosophers, scientists, they establish new theories and they're rising. So it's basically changing through the old ones dying, the new ones going into this. And also when there's a critical amount of counterfacts. But they are always suppressed by the older people till they die, or till they lose their power for some other reason. So it's never actually based on the facts itself that it changes. It's always a human thing, because the assumption there is that from the book, but it's also observed by other things, that there's like emotional interest, or there's like for example, the professor would invest his whole life into this theory and cannot change it then, because they lose their whole life work. So that's how also their emotion is sentimental actually.
Yeah, very good. So that's from a paper or a book called The Nature of Scientific Revolutions. It's either the nature or the anatomy of scientific revolutions, where Kuhn analyzes how you get these paradigm shifts in thinking, shifts in assumptions. And it's incredibly difficult to change. I mean, ISKCON does a great job in many ways of teaching Gaudiya Vaishnavism and reshaping, reframing people's understanding of themselves and life and the universe and God. But we bring a lot of other stuff with us that remains as it is. And we inherit, coming into ISKCON, we inherit a lot of learning as well that's not necessarily generative or not necessarily helpful. Okay, so we will conclude there for the time being. We'll have a 15-minute break, 5 o'clock. We'll regroup in 15 minutes. Does that work? Yeah? Stretch your legs, drink some water. Let's look at some different perspectives on culture. We're speaking about culture more broadly now at a societal level, but with implications or relevance to the organizational level as well. We're going to look at three perspectives. The first of them being integrationist. An integrationist perspective insists on homogeneity within the organization or within the broader society. The assumption being that if we have a strong culture where we all think the same way, where we all have the same shared values, where we all have the same attitudes towards things, then we will be united as a team, we will be strong, we will be indomitable, and we will be successful. And those are some of the assumptions implicit in that book, In Search of Excellence, as well. The striving for a strong, integrated, united culture where we are all on the same page, we're all on the same team. Sometimes devotees might long for that in ISKCON as well. We have so much division, so many different views, so many different attitudes. Why can't we all just be on the same page and think the same way? And which page? Well, it's the page that management would sanction as authorized, as legitimate. And what emerges from this is quite problematic. As I know from my own experience as a leader in ISKCON, as a Euro GBC for ISKCON Poland for 5 years, bringing this kind of attitude towards my leadership, trying to unite a yatra that was very divided and confused after different tumultuous events within ISKCON. And you start to see people, you start to see the devotees, you start to see your members as good ones and problems. Problem cases and the good ones, the ones who conform to my vision, the ones who conform to my values, those are the good ones. And these others who have different views or attitudes or positions, they become problem cases for you. And in an authoritarian regime, a dictatorial regime, the way of dealing with such cases is some of you are showing this gesture. The way of dealing with such cases is that you eliminate them. Enemies of the state. Enemies, why? Because they think differently. They're not team players. They have different attitudes than what is sanctioned by the Bureau. Should I be pressing something here, Mario,
Yes.
or is it just going to spring to action?
Yeah, not just press the flashing button.
Oops. Okay.
Perhaps on every step.
So, we have this assumption, many of my students bring this assumption into the university. They're assuming that strong integrated culture equals high performance, productivity, success. And there are serious problems with this assumption. Right at the back. Creating the unitary clone culture. Then we get another perspective. It's another side, another extreme. It's the fragmentation perspective. It says, we are all unique individuals. No two people are the same. We all have our unique experiences in life that inform our values and our attitudes and our behaviors, specific to each person. And so the idea then that we can have something as a culture where where many people are united with the same values and experiences and beliefs, and that's a fantasy. It's impossible. We are all unique, and therefore culture can never be from this fragmentation perspective. So we get these two sides then. An integrationist view and a fragmentation view, an anarchist view. Yeah?
So in our case, it's even more difficult because we're looking into unity in diversity. So
that's a middle position, in fact.
Is that a good position?
Well, I'm saying it's a middle position. It's the differentiation perspective, which says that, yes, there will be differences. In any group, there are going to be subgroups. That's not a bad thing. In this group here. So we have shared values that's brought us together. We are on a shared journey in this program. We're in Michael's, there's a lot in common between us. We are united in so many ways. But then we could also find subgroups within this group here as well. And it's not a bad thing. In fact, it makes life more rich, more colorful. That diversity is what creates variety and flavor. And strength. This is the opposite of the integrationist view. The integrationist view, in fact, is weak. It needs to be upheld artificially, to be propped up, because it's not natural. We are constantly diligent. We create a secret police to surveillance people to make sure they are conforming to the state or management sanctioned values, and to punish those who don't. And so in fact it's weak. It's maintained artificially. A differentiation position is in fact a much stronger position because it's more organic, it's more natural, and that idea of unity and diversity, so respecting differences but then also seeing what unites us and appreciating both. I have images there of Australian flags and so forth because Australia likes to promote itself as one of the world's most successful multicultural societies. Maybe it doesn't have that image externally, but at least internally, that's how politicians like to describe Australian society as a society that is very rich. Culturally, because it's an immigrant society. It's a society that is developed through people coming in from other parts of the world. So, let's further interrogate this notion that a unitary, homogeneous culture is necessarily a good thing. A strong culture is a strong integrated culture is a positive thing. So first, by asking if it's even possible. So let's drop the question of whether or not it's good or bad. Just let's ask, is it even possible? The reason being that most frequently the official culture of an organization is very different from the actual culture. The culture of the organization that you read about in the brochure or on the website or in the film, the short promotional film, the recruitment video, often contrasts with the way things actually are. An organization might have official values, official policies, official procedures, but then there will be all kinds of unofficial norms, unofficial procedures, unofficial values that in fact are more prevalent and more real, more realistic in representing the actual culture than the official description. And management might be so distant as to not even be aware. They don't even know what the culture of the organization is. I'll give you some examples. So, a great study by Van Manen on Disneyland. When I was a child, yes, even in the Hare Krishna movement in Australia, it was every child's dream to go to Disneyland. And as an adult, I got to fulfill that dream on the pretext of getting ideas for preaching. Am I right? Yeah. Okay, so a great study. Van Manen is observing the culture of Disneyland. And yeah, Disneyland, the Happy Kingdom.
Magic.
The magical kingdom, thank you, sorry. Misrepresenting Disneyland. The magical kingdom of Disney. And apparently staff are underpaid. They work long hours. They're out in the sun and the rain and the elements, so it's a tough job actually. They need to be constantly in performance. So the Disney culture, they define, they refer to their staff as actors, as performers. So they need to be constantly, so an actor can get off stage and then you're not performing anymore. But if you're a Disney staff member, standing hour after hour after hour in the sun and the rain or whatever, and you're constantly performing, it's a lot of emotional labor there. And then your happy theme park participants might get a bit aggro, a bit annoyed, spend a long day, the kids are playing up, and so they take out their frustrations on the staff, and so staff have to deal with rude theme park visitors. And so this subculture developed wherein staff members express their resistance to the organization, like we've given examples earlier of the car manufacturing, screw things on backwards purposefully and so on. Leave a dead rat in the car. Those things happen. And so Disney staff similarly express their resistance and frustration through these unofficial norms that develop. And they have code signals, they have ways of communicating to each other. This group here, particularly annoying. And so they have names for how they're going to get payback with the seatbelt squeeze. We're going to put them into their ride, and we're going to make their seatbelts particularly tight so when they go on their roller coaster, they're going to have the ride of their life. Or we might take out our frustration, another practice you'll not find in any Disney brochure or advertisement, but rife throughout the organization. All the staff members know about it, management don't know about it at all. It's called break up the party. If you have a particularly annoying group, as people are getting onto their ride at some point, as they get halfway, they communicate, this group here. As you get half of the members are on the ride, you say, oh, that's all we have enough room for. And so you break up the party, send this group on their ride, and then make that first group wait for the second group to then get on the... All of this subculture going on. This is the culture of the organization, not the official, but the unofficial culture. I'll give you another example. Did you know that more people are reported to die in hospitals in the early hours of the morning between 7 and 9 a.m.? Why do you think that might be?
Someone was helping them.
Someone helps them to the, okay, send them on their way to the next life. This is not one hospital, this is across hospitals. This study particularly is done in the United States of America. So across the United States of America, more people reported to die between the hours of 7 to 9 a.m. What's going on? Yeah.
If someone dies at night, then it's an whole trip to get everybody there to bring him where they need to go and stuff.
Yeah, sounds like you read the paper. Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was thinking, they all died in the night, so it's obvious, you just get in this very...
Process all the paperwork in the morning. absolutely. So at night we have a skeleton staff. It's a much less of a crew available to deal with all the paperwork of reporting a death, and more than just reporting, actually dealing with the body and so on and so forth. And so an unofficial practice within hospitals, you will not find it in any policy manual, you will not find it taught in any nursing school in the world. An unofficial practice that evolved was that you have your skeleton crew, they can't deal with it, they need to be dealing with the cases that need immediate attention, and so they wait for the incoming staff in the morning to come in, and then they fill in all the paperwork and they report the deaths and just deal with that. It's a much more engaged work requirement, commitment required to process a death in a hospital. And so then you look at the graph, and those deaths happen between 6 and 9 a.m., 7 and 9 a.m.
No one dies at night.
That's right.
Not allowed.
Contact with them.
Office is closed.
Everyone's just sleeping. These are the Vaisnava perspectives. Okay, so the suggestion here in this discussion then is that management might have their idea of what the culture is and what the ideal is, but and not sanction, not acknowledge, not accommodate other subcultures within the organization. And so the question being raised, is it possible to have an integrated culture? The suggestion is no, it's not. You might think you have it, and you might empower a secret police to monitor and enforce it, but it's not likely. Another body of work here.
I just have a question with the integrated culture, because there seems to be an emerging global culture of Coca-Cola, Hollywood, Holi, Christmas, sort of emerging somewhere.
The global culture, the global American culture.
Well, Holi is not American, but now it's a global phenomenon.
Sure.
And you have so many other such elements.
Sure. Yeah, so globalization, that's a whole other discussion. Concerns with globalization are that everything becomes the same, everything becomes similar, tendency is to become Americanized, American brands, American values, communicated through Hollywood. And this is a major concern. You'll have countries like Bhutan try to resist and promote and ensure that the continuance of their traditional culture. You'll have Russia, so Putin will justify certain interventions within society to ensure the protection of the Russian people from these foreign American influences. But not only, you'll find that in other authoritarian regimes as well. What we find though is that although yes, that is one aspect, we see sameness across the world, but we also find that sorry for the example, as McDonald's comes to India, they end up selling Maharaja burgers, which are 100% vegetarian. Not that I've ever eaten one and ever would, but just as an example. And they advertise it with a Brahmin, with a Sikha, saying, our Maharaja burger is 100% vegetarian, even the most orthodox Brahmin would eat it. So what's happening then is American culture coming in and being influenced by the local culture, being transformed by the local culture as well. And the same phenomenon happens with McDonald's in Japan and other parts of the world. And then you have, like you said, Diwali goes over to America, and Bollywood films are now being made less for the Indian audience and more for the diaspora international audience. And so these, so it is a concern, but as we look at the phenomenon, we also find pushback, whether it's intentional or evolved, as well. Okay, let's go on to discuss the very influential and famous work of a researcher named Hofstede. Hofstede was employed by IBM. Initially, he was employed to provide IBM. So remember the 1980s, this culture becomes the buzz. IBM is an international, multinational corporation. It wants cultural profiles. Okay, we can leverage American values to create competitive advantage in America, but IBM says we have operations across the world. We want cultural profiles for Europe, different European countries. We want cultural profiles for Asia. We want cultural profiles for Australia. And so Hofstede is commissioned by IBM in this very, very influential work to create these cultural profiles so IBM as an organization can leverage the national characteristics, the national cultural characteristics of these regions to provide competitive advantage in its global operations. So what Hofstede ends up doing is creating 4 dimensions, or identifying 4 dimensions that can define a national culture. He defines it along the dimension of individualism versus collectivism. American culture, remember we said earlier, is stereotypically described as the individualistic, the maverick, the person concerned with their own success and achievement, versus Japan, which is stereotypically described as a more collectivistic culture. So Asia more generally, China, India, and these other Asian, more collectivistic, a more greater concern with the community, with the family, and rather than individual success, pursuing their family success or their community's success, the success of their village, and so forth. Another dimension that Hofstede identifies is masculinity versus femininity. That this isn't about gender, this is about, about sex. This is about some regions where people, men and women, tend to be more masculine, and some regions where males and females tend to be more feminine. Another dimension that he identifies is power distance. So you have so one end is high power distance, another low power distance. Remember Australia, everyone's mate. So that's low power distance. And then you come to India, where everyone's sir, high power distance. It's who you know, it's what your connections are, it's what your title is. These things are all important in a high power distance society, whereas in Australia, that makes people very, very uncomfortable. In my university, I'm not Dr. Simpson, I'm Ace. First name, straight out from day one. That's the way it is. It can't be any other way. That's Australia, your mate. From the beginning. Okay, then finally, the next dimension relates to risk avoidance. So America would be stereotypically described as a culture where people prepare to take risks, high stakes games. They're prepared to be creative and initiative and really push boundaries. And then other cultures where people tend to be a lot more conservative and low risk in their engagement. Okay, so then based on these 4 dimensions, then Hofstede, he will define France people like this. On this dimension, they sit here. on that dimension they sit here, and so then you get these profiles for different regions. It's an interesting initiative, but you'll note that I kept saying stereotype, and there's a problem with stereotyping. These are generalizations, and we make blanket assumptions about a collective group based on stereotypical assumptions. So Hofstadter's research has been very influential, but it's been highly criticized as well for its limitations. Here's an example. One of those cultures that Hofstadter identified, he created a profile for Yugoslavia. Yugoslavians tend to be this and that and the other, and then just 8-9 years later, Yugoslavia was no more, and it was in conflict along cultural lines. So, Mataji here from Croatia. Yeah, so you would have lived through that transition. You would have seen the conflict and the tension that emerged, and it was very much based on cultural differences. Serbians are Russian Orthodox, Croatians and Slovenians are Catholic, and different political orientations, and who sided with who historically in different conflicts. And then there's the Muslim population as well in Bosnia. And so out of this one cultural group that Hofstadter identified, we have the emergence of very, very significant cultural divides and differences. Yes?
But there's also the breakup of one culture into many. It's called balkanization since then.
Aha.
So one unique culture can be broken apart
Yeah.
by internal and external forces into many.
Yeah. Good, thank you. The point that I'm making is that there was no such thing as a unitary Yugoslavian culture. Tito might have held it together for a period of time with his strong force of arms and his values, but beneath the surface there were such strong differences. My wife was born in Pristina, which was part of, anyway, we don't go there. Her family left earlier on in the piece and they got out okay, but other family members lost everything. They escaped, basically ran for their lives as war erupted there in Kosovo. And other family members were able to trade. Weeks before, they were able to swap houses with a family in Serbia, but they were Muslim families, so they said, look, you take our house here, and we'll take your house there. And so they managed to get it. But yeah, very, very significant cultural divides. And so this is just one example to show the limitations of trying to define an integrated cultural profile. It's my same point that I was making earlier in relation to Disneyland or the hospitals. Now I'm discussing it at a national level in relation to just this one example of Yugoslavia. So my first question was, is an integrated culture possible? My next question is it desirable? We have one more follow-up question. Is it desirable? Conformity, so getting people to sign up to the same culture because we're all family, can lead to accommodation of things that should not be accommodated, the blurring of ethical boundaries, things that we would ordinarily not tolerate are tolerated because of loyalty to the family. Our society has a history of that as well. Things that should have been reported to the police quickly, people who should have been properly charged and put on trial were not. because of our commitment and loyalty to the institution and the society. That happens at a corporate level as well. And as leaders in ISKCON, you're going to have to deal with that, and there's going to be, it's really hard. Yeah?
Well, Prabhupada's principle was unity in diversity, so, which is perfectly in line with our philosophy of Achikta. So it's, Vedic society accommodates everybody, it's just defining everyone's place and roles, which is important.
Yeah, thank you, Maharaj. Absolutely. That's what we're leading to, and we're happy to hear you articulate that. So we bring with us these ideas from In Search of Excellence, and we get this idea that we need to create a strong culture. That's what's going to solve our problems in ISKCON. That's what's going to solve the problems of our temple. And then there are these implications. And then we look to our philosophy and we find it's in fact a philosophy of diversity, unity, but respecting diversity as well.
Yeah, unity and diversity. That's the core of our
Yeah.
I have kind of a question. Basically, what we facing now, that we're trying to interfere with the law of God, trying to basically adjust His law according our whatever understanding, what is culture.
Very good.
And because our senses whatever uncontrolled, and we want, by the way, man is full when it's hot, he wants cool. When it's cool, when he was hot. Always what is not, he always want to come. And we are trying to adjust the culture and call it culture.
Yeah.
As Prabhupada said was, what about American culture? Is it American what?
Yeah.
Basically, what's coming, the bottom line is Krishna already gave everything.
Right.
And how to actually review it and evolve it.
Yeah, thank you.
My question is does it mean that all this culture actually is interference with Supreme Lord's law? If we can just try to adjust that principles and try to change all the time something. Does it mean that we're trying to...
Yeah, so dharma means to harmonize or align with the divine law. And when we're trying to engineer these things ourselves, we're in essence trying to be the Purusha.
It's going to become fatal anyway then.
Trying to be the controller, the all-powerful supreme person. And so, yeah, there's the problem. Thank you. Yeah?
At least in America, there's these two science fiction novels, A Brave New World in 1984.
Yeah.
Which are
George Orwell.
Yeah, Orwell. And 1984 is the more popular kind of scenario to create this homogeny. But the irony is that America has gotten there much more through Brave New World techniques and just giving everybody a shallow experience in happiness. So, is there any discussion about why there's a tendency towards this, like shallow cultural norms, without a deeper delving into like the internal self and the areas where we would find some difference? Does academia go there? Because that's where we go as devotees. But I'm wondering if you've ever encountered anything on the academic side of your thoughts about that.
It's more philosophy. Yeah, the management literature that I'm aware of doesn't really go there. Okay, so another problem of a strong, integrated organizational culture, aside from it being artificial, and here we have the example of the Soviet Union as well, Stalinism. We have Maoism in China, the artificial imposition of a unitary, integrated culture propped up by a Stasi or a KGB, or whatever the case may be. I was insinuating that earlier without saying it directly, but I figured it might be time to just come out and say it more directly. So another problem is a lack of counterfactual thinking, a lack of, forgive the term, as I say it in this group, I realize that the problems with this term, devil's advocacy. But what emerges from a lack of counterfactual thinking is what is referred to as groupthink, where we all just conform, we agree with whatever the leader says, we become yes people because we want to be accepted by the group. And one study into the challenge of disaster, actually I have it here. One study into the challenge of disaster found that one of the reasons for the challenge of disaster, that's an American NASA space shuttle that exploded shortly after takeoff, was that groupthink had set in NASA. You have the smartest people, some of the smartest people on the planet, they get employed by this organization, people feeling that they want to be accepted, that they want to be good enough, and they're seeing concerns. They have concerns about the shuttle, but they don't express them because no one else is saying anything. And if no one else is saying anything and everyone else here is brilliant, then maybe there's not really a problem, and I don't want to be the fool. So an emperor's new clothes type situation where groupthink sets in, and because of this lack of counterfactual thinking, then the whole organization is going in a direction where they're making huge mistakes. But everyone's going along with it because that's the consensus or the view of the leader. Whereas when you actually start to speak to people below, they're all saying, yeah, I actually have really serious reservations about that as well. Oh yeah, I had concerns way back when. Why didn't you say anything? Well, no one else was, and so I figured everything must be all right. Groupthink. Groupthink is a problem, and it's a problem in a culture where alternative views and voices are not encouraged, they're not respected, but rather suppressed. In any business school today, Enron will be held up as the example of what not to do. Enron was one of the world's largest energy companies. It was a company that had a revenue in 2001 of $101 billion. They received award after award from Fortune magazine from 1996 to 2001 as the most innovative company in the US. Declared 7th most successful company in 1999, and within a month, and MBAs from the top business schools are knocking on the door to get into this organization. And they come in as high-achieving, well-educated MBAs, and once they're in the organization and get inducted, they get inducted into a culture of corruption and fraud and bullying. So yeah, definitely a strong culture, but the wrong culture. When it went bankrupt within a month in 2001, share value crashed to basically nothing as it became apparent that there was all kinds of accounting frauds taking place. They were declaring their revenue on account of projected future incomes that they have not yet banked. And so that's how they justified their reporting, and it was propping up their share value. So that the market is seeing, wow, this company is super profitable, let me get some of those shares. And so they're reporting this revenue that they don't actually have. And the auditors, they were in on they were being paid off as well. And so a whole circle of corruption here. When they crashed, it didn't just destroy the lives of those tens of thousands of employees who lost their pension funds and not just their livelihoods, but their pension funds, but it had an impact on the entire US economy because it was such a big organization. And as they say, when the US economy sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. And so it had an impact on the world economy as well. and some see it also as a precursor to the global financial crisis of 2007-8. Let me see where we're going here. Okay, so we're coming to time, and I'll just wrap up these last few slides. This is another view of organizational culture. It's the OCAI, Competing Values Framework. There's an online tool that you can look this up. And there's an online tool, respond to the questions in relation to an organization that you know well, maybe ISKCON, and you'll get a feedback on the type of culture that that organization has, and it'll be feedback which will kind of map. So it might be, it might show more hierarchical or more of a clan, or it might show something that's more balanced. There's no necessary ideal culture in this model, but it is a very interesting model because it does take into account these subcultures or sub-values. So it describes 4 different types. Hierarchical culture, which is very bureaucratic. If I say bureaucracy, now we know what that's all about. We say, okay, that's the hierarchical culture. Then you have a clan culture, which is very much about human relations movement type values. So really valuing the person and giving attention there, seeing ourselves as a family or as a tribe. Then you have a market-oriented culture, which is totally external looking, and it's all about its profitability and its return to the bottom line. So a very results-oriented culture. And then you have top right quadrant and adhocracy, which is all about innovation and creativity. So Apple might be your example there of a dynamic, entrepreneurial, risk-taking, values-driven type organization. And so these are seen as 4 archetypes of organizational culture: rules-based bureaucracy, peoples-based organization, innovation, creativity-based organization, and a market-based. And each organization will map into each of these quadrants in different ways. And the way this tool can be used is by asking members to respond to the questions in relation to how the organization is, and then how they would like it to be. And you get 2 different pictures, and they look different. And then you can ask members, then you can have a conversation around, okay, this is what it is, and this is what that's what the members say they would like. What can we do together to try to achieve this? And it's actually a very powerful cultural change tool because it's driven by the members themselves. The vision is driven by the members themselves, as opposed to something that's being handed top down. So that's something that you can look up, and some say that one of the world's most researched cultural frames. We'll just go through these last few slides on culture and power, culture management as self-domination. So culture management is very much a product of post-bureaucracy, a post-bureaucratic type approach to organizing, seen as a subtle form of domination and control. You're not framing what people have to do, but rather trying to create a context that frames what people want to do. They see their opportunity to achieve and be successful and have all of these perks, and so they want to be the star performer, the star contributor within the organization, to be recognized as such, and so they work harder than they ever would if they were working in a terrorist type organization where they're being surveillanced and controlled. So the question is it ethical to manage, to try to engineer an organizational culture? Is it right for managers to seek to manipulate employees' values and sense of who they are, to create designer employees or corporate clones? Okay, so we draw some conclusions here. We've looked at 3 different levels of organizational culture in Shine's model: artifacts, espouse values, basic assumptions. Basic assumptions are the deepest level, very difficult to change, and then the question is it ethical to try to reshape and remold those? And so if it's possible, is it ethical? But then even, is it desirable? Or is it better to have an organization that does embrace diversity and sees strength in diversity rather than creating a homogeneous culture? Okay, so we will conclude there. Thank you very much. We're just on 5 minutes over, so I think you'll forgive me. 3 minutes according to my phone. And we look forward to further engagement. We'll start tomorrow with some Vedic perspectives on this culture management, and then we'll go into discuss managing individuals. Thank you. Good night. Thank you.